Masks are very controversial. No investigation into COVID is complete without the subject of masks coming up. Masks are very controversial. People are arguing about whether they're effective, not effective, whether children should be sent to school every day in a mask, what the deleterious effects might be of masks, etc. It actually has caused people to break out into fights in public situations over this mask issue. The ironic thing is that most of the people who are commenting on masks really have no background or expertise to be able to speak to it in an authoritative way. So we went out to find someone who actually has the credentials to clarify this mask issue once and for all, and that's Stephen Petty. Let's get into this interview. Stephen, thanks so much for having this conversation. Man, there's a lot of controversy around the subject of masks, and I'm glad I have an expert that can clear it up for us. So tell us a bit about your background, kind of your academic background, how you got to be doing what you're doing right now.
Sure. I guess my formal training was undergraduate and graduate degrees in chemical engineering at the University of Washington in Seattle. And then I did an MBA with a focus on behavioral marketing, finished with honors and first in my class. Long time ago. I've been doing this for over 40 years. So as they say, I'm closer to the end than the beginning, which I think is kind of humorous. In the last 20 years, I've been named, that is disclosed as a testifying expert in over 400 cases with a primary emphasis on exposure calculations, exposure control, personal protective equipment. We used to call it PPE, but now everybody knows what that means. As well as warnings, how to adequately train and warn people about the hazards they might encounter. So currently I'm one of the named experts in, for instance, this Monsanto Roundup litigation, and I serve as an exposure PPE warnings expert in those cases. I think I've been in 33 of those. So I've been doing this for quite a while. The biggest issue is that the area of industrial hygiene is not well understood by the public. I think it's maybe you work in a dentist office or something. And my biggest complaint, if you were, is that the media and the public tend to go to medical doctors for expertise on exposure and exposure control, and that's really not their sandbox. What we do is we go out into the field, and when people are feeling bad, sick, etc., it's the definition of an industrial hygiene to anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control things that will make you sick or even kill you. And so that's what we do. And there are not a lot of us, especially certified. And so we have medical doctors talking about exposure and exposure control, and that's really not their sandbox. I mean, it's kind of like having a heart physician doing your dentistry or a dentist doing your heart surgery. Both of them might be fully qualified for what they do, but you don't want one doing the other guy's job. My biggest complaint is that I've spent my entire life trying to protect workers and the public. And my position overall is that masks essentially don't do that. They take the air out of the room for things that would actually help. And that's been my position now. I started going public really in March or so, and it's picked up steam. And I even generated a whole bunch of podcasts to try to get information out to people. And first YouTube, and they didn't care for that. So then I went to Rumble.
What I'm hearing in your voice, and I think rightfully so, is a sense of frustration, right, around the fact that, as you said, this is a area of significant specialty, and many people who are commenting on it really don't have the background training or professional experience to know properly what they're talking about. When it comes to this issue and incidentally, kind of outrageous that you are an expert with the right qualifications and you're being censored. I mean, is that kind of incomprehensible to you?
Yeah, I wrote a podcast called The Great Gatsby or The Holy Mask, talking about the gaps around the mask. That was actually kind of funny, but proving pretty much that masks cannot possibly work at the micro level. And it was censored as medical misinformation, which is quite ironic because I'm not a medical doctor, I'm an exposure expert. So I wrote the folks in the basement that no, it wasn't medical misinformation because it had nothing to do with medicine. It had to do with exposure and exposure control, but they weren't impressed. And then I had a second podcast, number 6, which was on things that would actually work. And they took that down as medical misinformation as well. And what was kind of sad is I had upwards of 20 or 30,000 views in less than a week.
Mm.
Basically, if I used the word mask, then that was medical misinformation and I was censored. A little bit sad because the things I was talking about were all based on actual literature, which I listed at the bottom of each slide or graphic. And most of the science I'm talking about is over 100 years old. So I wasn't really talking about rocket science. I was talking about some very basic fundamentals.
Mhm.
That wasn't going to stop me. So I continued to speak out regardless. Just made the job a little more difficult.
Well, we're here to help you with that. So now let's take these down one at a time. Let's talk about why masks don't work, and then later we talk about what would work. So let's look at the whole mask thing. So there's been a lot of controversy about masks. It seems to be have been politicized. The idea of masking. Some people are saying it's just virtue signaling, and and that's why you need to wear them. Other people saying that no, they absolutely have a positive effect on helping to prevent the spread of coronavirus, et cetera. Can you kind of walk us through masking, maybe understanding the difference between a mask and a respirator, and what the truth is from a scientific standpoint around this issue?
Sure. I'll tackle it in three levels. I do believe, and when you read, and if you've seen the material I put out there, I believe the CDC and OSHA, for example, the scientists really know better. They know masks don't work, but they're pinned between the science and the politicians. And in my view, it's simply an opinion, but based on reading how they've changed. Since I started going public, you see a lot more language at CDC saying, well, masks aren't really respirators. They're not respiratory protection. Engineering controls would be better. It's been quite remarkable that little old me is, I believe, having an impact, because I had a person associated with the CDC write me and wasn't so happy about it. But here's the bottom line. At the macro level, I testified Monday in a case in Michigan. And the public health official said that masks were the most effective way known to stop the coronavirus. Well, that was just garbage. And I said, okay, well, let's bring up the state of Michigan cases for the last 2 years where you have a mask mandate. And I said, it looks like a lumpy mountain. And to me, it looks like you have mostly cases in the colder months when people are indoors. That's when you expect people to get sick. But I said, if you buy into the masks are the most effective thing you could do, which I don't, it's the least effective thing. Wouldn't you expect that the cases would drop with time? I mean, wouldn't that be the logical extension, that if these masks were so effective, wouldn't you think cases would drop with time? And I pulled up chart after chart for the US as a total, for Sweden, it turns out, didn't ever wear masks, and they have lower case rate, and it's pretty much gone away. But on the micro level, we have what we call hierarchy of controls, and it's like an inverted pyramid. And it's been around since 1950. And what it shows is how one can control a hazard, including diseases, from the most effective things to the least effective things. And there are some of them that don't apply, but the one that applies the most is engineering controls. And that would be where we either dilute with fresh air or we destroy the virus. And then the next one's administrative controls, which means we'll limit the time in the area. Sometimes that's not, you can't do that. And then the least effective is what we call PPE. And for protecting the lungs, inhalation, that would be respirators. And I point out that masks don't even fit in the hierarchy. They're below it. They're not even respirators. And the reason that PPE, which is even better than masks, is the lowest is because we know from decades and decades of experience that putting masks or PPE on people is very, very uncomfortable. And as a consequence, they won't wear it properly. So it doesn't have its effectiveness. So we typically want to use PPE in emergency situations and then go up to engineering controls and do things higher up on the hierarchy to get rid of them. And so I point out time and time again that masks don't even fit in the hierarchy as something to control things. And this is basic industrial hygiene science. The other thing, just to illustrate it, is I point out that if you look at people wearing masks, almost invariably, there'll be big gaps you probably put your small finger on either side of your nose below your eyes, and then it usually crinkles up on the edges. And the virus, and people will debate this, but it's on the order of 0.1 microns. And if you compare that to a human hair, you find that the virus is on the order of 1,000 times, up to 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair, and up to 40,000 times smaller than the area of a human hair. And I ask everybody, can you slip a human hair around your mask? Of course, we got a lot of men that are wearing them with beards, so they got lots of human hairs slipping by their mask. And I said, well, this little virus is like 1,000. I mean, it's like a super freeway. So regardless of whether you thought the mask did any good at all, if you've got gaps around it, it does no good at all. Especially if the gaps are 2 to 3%, it effectively wipes out any effectiveness the mask might have had, which is very low. And so I just asked the question over and over again: can you slip a human hair by your mask? And of course, the question is yes. And that was the Great Gatsby podcast that I did on Rumble. The bottom line is that with masks, unlike respirators, you cannot seal them. This is in the literature. You cannot seal a mask. That's why I pointed out that respirators, at least, you have seals, you got to have medical clearance to wear them. You can't wear facial hair. You've got to be fit tested to make sure they work, etc. None of that occurs with masks.
Is there any, so and I just want to be clear about one thing, saying, as a general statement, they don't work, but is there any mitigating effect at all, or it's pretty much worthless as far as, I'm talking about masks at the moment. Let's say that it was fitted fairly well. As you said, they can't seal it all. You could always find a way to get something as thin as a human hair, around the edges. But is there any mitigation effect, or is it just basically, it's nonsense?
Well, I get asked that question a lot in litigation. Are you saying it's zero? And I always use this parable. I said, let's imagine that you have a mathematician and an engineer in a room, and the moderator, like yourself, asks them, look at the far wall and have that distance, and have it again and have it forever. And then the moderator asks both of the gentlemen, or whoever they are, did you get to the wall? And the mathematician says theoretically no, and the engineer says yes, close enough. And so my answer is basically, well, it might not be zero. It's really, really, really close, especially when you consider the fact that real masks worn by people are always going to have gaps. They're never going to be sealed. And when you see these studies being done by people that say masks work, what they do is they fix them on mannequins or fixtures where they're perfectly sealed. And then they show, well, they might have 20% efficacy. But here's the thing. There's also literature that says if you get to about upwards of 3% gap area, then whatever effectiveness that mask had is zero. And there's also some interesting literature that I've just recently been citing. The American Industrial Hygiene Association on September 7th of 2020 put out a graphic that talked about the fact that just because something has a little bit of efficacy doesn't mean it's something we would do. In other words, I would never put somebody in a mask to protect them from asbestos fibers. And they're on the order of 50 times on average larger than these COVID virons. So what they showed was that in order for something to be recommended as something to help control or reduce risk, they looked at relative risk reduction. So let's say we want to reduce the cases of COVID from 100% of a exposure scenario to whatever. They said that whatever you use, you should have 90% relative risk reduction. If it's not 90% or more, then we don't think that's an effective solution, because we don't want, even there we're saying 10% of the people could still be at risk. So what did they show in their graphic? They showed that masks were only 5 to 10%. And this was assuming much better fits than now the new literature shows. And there was also a paper out by Shaw doing the same thing with perfectly sealed masks that somewhere between 10 and 15% effectiveness. So these things are effective at the 5 to 15% level if they're perfectly sealed, which they aren't in real world. but that's way below a 90% effectiveness of something we in our profession would recommend to actually help people. So that whole argument about, well, it'll do something. Well, would it be acceptable if us in the exposure control world said, well, we'll give you a solution that stops 5% of the asbestosis cases, but 95% of the people get it? I think people would be outraged.
Yeah.
So mask can't possibly be a solution that you would look at. You want to look at things that have 90% effectiveness or so in terms of relative risk reduction. And even our trade association says that. And I can tell you, having been in the field for almost 40 years and having testified in many, many cases, that's just common sense. It makes sense. We're not going to provide solutions that don't help the vast or the super majority of people.
Is there a downside to wearing masks? In other words, so basically you're saying, there's very little, if any, upside to it. But if people are wearing masks all day, does it, is it known to have any adverse effect on their oxygen levels, on if they're wearing the same mask all day long? Kids going to school and wearing them all day, there's a lot of speculation around adverse effects that might occur. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, there's some areas I could testify to and some I can't, but there was a paper out by Kisselinsky. They went through over 1,000 studies on the negative effects associated with masks, and they reduced it to 109 qualitative and 44 quantitative results. And and there are probably 20 to 30 effects that are known and recognized in the literature, at least according to their work. So, but I can comment on a couple of them directly. Some I can't, like for instance, I'm not a board certified psychiatrist, so it probably isn't appropriate that I talk about those areas. Although I will tell you that the first time we implemented engineering controls was in a special needs high school of 750 students, mixed with regular students and autistic children. Because the children cannot learn, according to the schoolmaster, wearing masks because they read facial expressions, plus they tend not to want to wear them. We put in engineering controls and did not wear masks beginning in August of 2020 in a school in Westerville, Ohio. And as a result of that, they went through the school year pretty normal. I think they might have had 2 or 3 cases. They think they were actually brought in. So there are better solutions, but we know that children have a hard time learning if they can't read facial expressions. Mm-hmm. Now, in my field, I've testified many, many times on mold, and what happens with a mask is that it's a perfect breeding ground for mold and bacteria. And by that I mean the temperature and the humidity or moisture levels in the mask are perfect amplification breeding grounds. And let me give you an example. If you look at a wall and you don't see mold, the spore count level will be less than 10,000 spores per square inch. Whereas if you can see visible mold on a wall or on an object, a mask, it's going to be over 1 million. So it doesn't go up from 10,000 to or less than 10,000 to 12,000. It goes from less than 10,000 to over 1 million. Well, the problem is when you get that amplification is now you're going to rebreathe in those toxins, right, at much amplified levels, like orders of magnitude. And so now you've got that issue. And we also know from fit testing of respirators, we have a medical clearance that you're restricting breathing. And when you do that, especially COPD people and people with other respiratory ailments, they're not allowed to wear a respirator. And the reason for it is that if you start to restrict oxygen flow, then their oxygen levels in their bloodstream are reduced, and that has an impact on pulse rate and blood pressure because your body wants to get the oxygen in. Those are things I can talk about because, I work on respirator fit tests, and we have to have the medical clearance before we do anything more. And I know that the mold, there was a study out of Florida that showed there was amplified mold levels and bacterial levels on masks. It was done by some parents, and it was criticized because the parents did it. But I can tell you firsthand that given the conditions that are more likely than not to exist on a mask, that is a perfect breeding ground for mold and bacteria.
We've been getting mixed signals even from Fauci or the CDC, relative to, mask, you need a mask, now you don't need a mask, now we should double mask. Did you find it absurd that, oh, well, one mask isn't enough anymore, now you need two, and two would do the trick? What were your thoughts around that when that was being promulgated?
Well, my first thoughts were he's an infectious disease doctor. He's not an exposure. He's not an industrial hygienist. He's not an exposure controls expert. So I think he got it right the first time.
When you say got it right the first time, what did he get right?
Masks don't work. They're not effective. You don't need to wear a mask.
And that was the first statement, right? So
yeah, and you always say people in their first, your first thoughts are usually the most correct ones. I can't say what's in his head, but I think we can. I don't think that his subsequent positions are justified by the science.
So now, if they were to talk about, and they don't yet, but they talk about respirators, and you see like N95 respirators and maybe other forms of respirators. What's the difference between those and the kind of the surgeon's mask that you see?
Well, the primary difference is that respirators are defined in terms, there's a whole protocol and standard on respiratory protection and the use of respirators, and it's under OSHA, under what they call the Respiratory Protection Standard. The Federal Register name for your folks is 29 CFR 1910.134. I've testified on this hundreds of times. And it has very specific requirements about medical clearance. You have to fit test it. Initially, you have to fit test it annually. You have to know how to clean and store them, how often to replace them. But the big difference between a respirator and a mask, in my opinion, is that by definition, a respirator can be sealed. And by definition, a mask cannot. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look at my podcast, I have my wife on it. There's a 20-second initial clip that people probably, it's a little bit subtle, but I have her in a half-face respirator and I'm fit testing her with an irritant smoke. And then I fit test her with a mask. And her reaction, which is very organic, when I hit her with the irritant smoke, is like she got hit with smelling salts.
Wow.
And I had a standard offer that I would offer anybody in my offices here, because they were arguing with me a year ago. I'll give you 30 nights of steak dinners at that cloth mask. You won't smell the irritant smoke. And I didn't have anybody take me up. Mm-hmm. That's the primary reason, is that, yes, and appreciate that the irritant smoke, you can see the smoke, at least you can see portions of it. Mm-hmm. If you can see particles with normal light, they're at least 50 microns or 500 times greater than visible particles. It's obviously getting around the gaps. I always say, okay, let's imagine that you have a wall that's just insulation, but it's got windows or doors, and those doors are open. And you're going to run smoke, or you're going to run some sort of contaminant against that wall system. Where do you think the contaminant is going to go? Is it going to try to go through the highest resistance area or the lowest resistance area? Well, of course, it's going to go through the open doors and windows, just like COVID is going to run right through the gaps.
With then saying there are other solutions, maybe engineering solutions to the situation, what would work? Okay, so basically we can conclude masks don't work. People don't really wear respirators. If they do, they're probably not properly fitted. They're probably not properly managed and cared for, et cetera. There can be a downside to the masks, as you cited, as far as being a breeding ground for, potentially for maybe mold or bacteria. But now, what would work? What would potentially help, as far as saying that we can do something to mitigate, the amount of coronavirus that might be in an environment, so people are less exposed?
Yeah, there's really two categories of solutions. One is increased fresh air dilution, and the other is, well, there's really three: dilution, increased fresh air, filtration, and then destruction technologies. I'm reminded, and I won't quote it exactly right, and I've said this before, General Tecumseh Sherman, after he's a Civil War general, and when he finished, he actually wrote 2 editions of his memoirs, but at the end he had lessons learned, and he had a line that said something to the effect that I learned that the men who were sick and wounded healed much faster under a giant shade tree than in those toxic enclosed buildings. And when he talked about people in high density multifamily area like New York City, don't go out to the parks, don't go to the beaches. I want to pull my hair out. Last place you want people under where there's infectious diseases is all congregated together indoors. Best thing in the world is for them to be outdoors where you get maximum dilution. And so I've told people over and over again for the last 18 months, if you're concerned, crack your doors or windows when people come over. If you do that, you probably dilute the concentration, whatever's there, by at least a factor of 1,000 or 100, I should say, and maybe up to 1,000. And I said, yeah, you'll use some more energy, but that's a better thing. And in fact, the school where when I talked to the teachers there, because they were concerned about no masks, and I said, well, crack your windows a little bit. Yeah, you'll increase, especially when it's warmer, you have to do humidity control and you'll use more energy. But in these times, why not? In large commercial and industrial buildings, they have what they call dampers, which control the amount of fresh air into the systems. And it's mainly done before energy code reasons. And I said, well, let's override those dampers and have a maximum open so we get the maximum fresh air. Yeah, we use more energy. We're going to have some humidity control issues, but until we get our handle on this for other solutions, let's do that. You can use filtration systems, but they have to be pretty high level, what they call MERV, probably 14 to 17 or higher. And you have to have somebody, so it's going to put a little more pressure drop on your systems. You use more energy on the furnace fans. And you have to have somebody that changes them out from time to time. On the destruction side, there's a whole host of technologies that are, and I just rewrote that section yesterday because there's more material that just came out in a good paper in September of 2021 in an ASHRAE journal, American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers. And the bipolar ionization technology is recognized to have upwards of over 90% destruction of the virus, along with molds and other bacteria. I have those in my homes and my businesses, and they can be purchased for about $400. They'll treat 6 refrigerant tons, which is like 6,000 square feet. And they were also put in the school that I mentioned. There's hydrogen peroxide systems that aerosolize that. There's UV and plasma systems that can be put in that have higher effectiveness on the order of 90% removal. So I list about 6 or 7 technologies that could be used and their pricing. And then I also list some that are emerging as well. So those have much more potential. I've always said to everyone, what if we'd offered the bipolar ionization technology to everyone through HVAC contractors, heating, refrigeration, air conditioning contractors, and sort of say $500. We give the contractors $100 to put them in, because right now you buy them for $400, they charge you $800 or so. I said, instead of giving people $1,600 or more to sit at home and do nothing, to me it just seems like. And then some people will say to me, well, why are you sure these things are all super effective? And I said, well, as best as I can tell, they are, but wouldn't it have been nice if we spent a portion of these billions of dollars evaluating these technologies? I mean, why is it up to me as an individual to do that on behalf of the whole country? So, I mean, I have 9 patents on HVAC systems, and I was a senior research scientist for 20 years. I've looked at the material, and as best as I can tell, there aren't side effects, and it appears that it does work. And in fact, in September, there was another study looking at that technology that says, yeah, it looks like it works.
Well, makes almost too much sense, right? You know, it just seems that if something is not pointing toward the only solution is a vaccine, then you know they don't want to spend any money on it. But you're right. I mean, it wouldn't be very difficult to do some research to test systems as you just described, and it's fairly measurable and something that maybe could provide a great benefit. So the irrationality seems to be puzzling, at least to me. Does it feel that way to you?
Well, my conclusion is always, because I remember I was trained in behavioral marketing. So in fact, I testify on the art of persuasion in these Roundup trials, and I'm qualified to do so because I finished first in my class in that. I always say people are rational in their own minds. And when you look at the issue of mask and you realize there really isn't a science basis for it, you kind of say, well, then what is the basis for it? And my conclusion, and it's pure opinion, is that it's a control issue.
Mhm.
That it has very little, almost nothing to do with science.
Yeah.
Now there is this rationalization. I mean, you're the popular kid on the block with CDC if you produce a paper that says masks work. But there was recent one where a bunch of people sent it to me out of Bangladesh that said masks work. But if you look at the data, it actually shows masks don't work. And it was so poorly controlled that now even various people have said, well, that's pretty much a garbage study. The best study that's out there was the Danish study where they looked at about 6,000 people, half wore masks, half didn't. It was double blind. These folks, and it basically concluded that whether you wore a mask or didn't wear a mask, within the statistics, it didn't make any difference in terms of getting disease. And they had a heck of a time getting that published because it wasn't a popular thing to say beginning of the year. And CDC on their website, in fact, I got asked this, well, CDC criticizes this. And I said, yeah, their two major criticisms are questionable. The one is, well, it only looked at 0.1% of the population of Denmark, which if I do the math right, would mean that's Denmark has like 6 million people if they looked at 6,000 people.
Right.
And I said, so are you saying that they only, in the United States, at 350 million people, that mean that the only study that's relevant is to use 35,000 people? I said, well, that's nonsense. Epidemiology doesn't require you to look at a percentage of the country's population. And then they said, well, basically, they didn't do a study that they should have done, which is kind of weird. In other words, they did the study they did. Does wearing a mask affect disease rate or not? And they said, well, you really should have done a paired test where one person wore the mask and the other person didn't, and they were together. I said, well, then how is that a blind study? And I said, where do you find 3,000 pairs of people that are going to do that? So it was kind of a nonsensical criticism in both cases. And yet that's what's put out there because they don't like the results.
I might mention, you said in the United States that it would correlate to about 35,000 people. Well, that's how many they had in the vaccine studies. So, it's exactly that amount, if I'm not mistaken, it was 35,000. So it's,
But there's no requirement to do a, I mean, obviously more people is better oftentimes in terms of the power of a study, but there's no requirement to base it on a percentage of the population of the country. I mean, that's just kind of weird to me.
Yeah.
Whenever you look at a mass study, and I went through all the CDC ones at the time. They've added a few since I criticized them. What you find in all these studies is that they either don't have a control group, and by a control group I mean if you're going to say masks work, that's your hypothesis, then you need a group that's as similar as you can that isn't wearing masks, right? And then you look at the difference and see if it made a difference. There's almost no control groups in all these studies they cite. Or there's a confounding situation where they're looking at multiple things that are affecting. In other words, they'll say, well, we masked people, we did social distancing, we changed air conditioning. And as a consequence of all three of those, it made a difference. And I said, well, how do you know if the mask was any part of that? You can't. There's no way. It's confounded. In other words, you got to separate these. Now, to my knowledge, there's only one and maybe two studies that have done this in schools. And there was one that did it in Florida where they had the only factor they looked at was masking. In one case, they had a group of students that were masked. In another case, they didn't. And this had to do with the teachers and the students. And that study shows within statistics that it made no difference. So from a macro level, looking at you can look at this mask from three levels. You can look at the macro level. Well, if we want to plot cases with time and you look at places where they've had mask mandates, like California, Los Angeles, and you see the rates go up and they move all over the place. So it doesn't look like masks are doing much there. Then you look at these paired studies where they actually just look at mask versus no mask. And both studies that I've seen don't show any differences. Now, I think there's one in Washington State that also shows that as well, but I haven't really reviewed that study. But they constantly pull these studies out where they don't have a control or they mix a whole bunch of things at the same time. So you don't know whether that had any difference or not. And then you look at the micro level and you say, well, look at the gaps around these masks. the Viron's 1,000 times smaller in diameter than a human hair, and you could probably put your thumb, dozens of human hairs by the mask in places. So at 3 levels, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I guess, they could also do, basic, maybe more basic science research, as far as saying, let's have somebody with a mask on as it's typically worn. And I imagine if they could just breathe or cough or whatever, see what comes out, and maybe measure that and say it's actually retaining it, or things are getting out. I imagine they have some sort of sensors that could be able to detect particles, or is such a thing possible?
Well, yes and no. And in fact, CDC cited a study that quote unquote did that. One of the big things that is misinformation out there is this whole concept of droplets. Um, remember when we first heard about COVID, it was surfaces, surfaces, surface. Let's wipe down everything because that's a problem. And then they went to droplets. There's been a number of people, including myself, have said, no, this has always been about aerosols. And the distinction is that aerosols are particles less than or equal to 5 microns, and droplets are 5 to 10 microns and greater. Well, there was work by Edwards looking at monkeys that showed that well over 99% of the particles emitted from monkeys that were first healthy and then made sick were aerosols, and that only a tiny fraction were particles or were droplets. And so they constantly will say, well, droplets can be stopped by masks. Well, I said, well, the problem is that the aerosols are the vast majority of it. And the problem with the droplets is they fall to the floor within minutes, whereas, and I've shown this, whereas the aerosols can stay in the air upwards of 50 days.
Wow.
So you've got a couple of problems. People have to be informed on the difference between droplets and aerosols. And you see CDC now commenting, well, if they're aerosols, then you have to have PPE, which means a respirator. So as soon as you say they're aerosols, the 6-foot rule is destroyed, because there's no way in the world that something that can stay suspended for upwards of 50 days is going to stay within 6 feet. And I used to call those dots in stores the dummy dots. Nobody thought that an aerosol was going to stop at 6 feet, had to be a dummy. And I see now at Walmart where I went, they got them removed because there is no science. I actually looked to try to find the science, and you see that Gottlieb came out publicly on CBS last week and said, we didn't have any basis for that 6-foot number. Well, I knew that because I looked at all the literature and I couldn't find it. But the real problem you have is that once you agree that it's an aerosol, then even CDC will admit that you've got to use a respirator. So once you admit that these particles from COVID are primarily aerosols and not droplets, the 6-foot rule has no meaning, and the mask really has no meaning. And so they've tried to play this game of telling everybody that masks stop droplets, but that isn't the problem. It's the aerosols. And everybody says, what about these droplets? I said, well, there's study after study that show that droplets fall to the ground right away. And secondly, they get stopped by your respiratory tract, like your silica and your mucous tissues. And thirdly, they don't carry as much of the virus as the little guys. So the little guys, the aerosols, will reach deep into the lung. They get around the protective things. They stay suspended for days to multiple days, and they reach deep into the lung, and they're the particles that are associated with infection or disease. So at multiple levels, the public has been misinformed. But once you agree, I've always said the magic word's aerosols, because once you agree that the vast majority of the particles are aerosols, then masks in the 6-foot rule are rendered meaningless. I've had a couple of people criticize me and say, well, Mr. Petty, it's not really 0.1 microns, it's 0.2 or 0.3. And I said, well, they're way less than 5. I said, we're having this argument about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and we're looking for the iceberg. And the iceberg is that these little particles are the problem, and we got to provide solutions that will actually work.
if everybody suddenly went to respirators, because respirators are also made of cotton, right? They're different shaped.
Well,
Yeah.
yes and no. I call it the bottom of the barrel respirator is an N95.
Okay.
And then after that, you have a half face, full face. You have air purifying respirators, and then you go to powered respirators that actually supply oxygen, like Scott Air Packs.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually in trial on Monday, and the public health official kept referencing N95s as masks. And I said, no, 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 no. N95s are respirators. It was stunning to me that the public health official that issued an order that all the kids had to wear masks didn't know the difference between a respirator and a mask.
Mm-hmm.
And she kept referring to the fact that the mask would stop the droplets. And I said, with all due respect, are you aware of the fact that the droplets aren't the issue, it's the aerosols? And I'll show you the studies that prove that. And she said, well, I was following the science. I was following CDC. And I said, well, I guess you were following the cliff notes because you didn't really read the science.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I rely on CDC. And I said, yeah, but you're issuing an order that impacts thousands of people. Don't you have an obligation to read the documents you're citing? And she said, well, it was an emergency order. I said, yeah, it was an emergency, but you've had 18 months. It's not like I will issue an order on the forensic side. If a building's ready to collapse, I'll say you can't put people in that building till we fix it because that's imminent hazard. Or if you have a big spill of a toxic chemical, yeah, in hours or days, you need to stop people from being exposed. But I said, COVID, we've known about for, gosh, we're coming up on 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I said, so you've had plenty of time to read the science. This isn't like you need to issue the order because you got something happening tomorrow. So it's all sort of bogus arguments, you know. People haven't done their homework.
And it's interesting because it's as if saying, well, following the CDC and following the science is the same thing. And I think it's been pretty clear, no, not necessarily. It's funny because it says I'm following science, but I'm doing it dogmatically, which is kind of a contradiction.
Yeah, well, I mean, even CDC for a period took the mask mandate off, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when everybody says to me, well, we're going to follow the science, I want to kind of throw up as a scientist. I said, well, first of all, that presumes that the science is monolithic, that everybody thinks the same thing. And the science is almost any topic, there are a variety of opinions about the science. Mm-hmm. And secondly, the science evolves with time. Yeah. And thirdly, the science is always paid for by somebody that has a vested interest. So it gets pushed one direction or the other. I say to people, go back and read all the cigarette studies in the 50s that showed that cigarette smoking doesn't cause cancer.
Right.
They were all paid for by the tobacco companies, most of them. And I said, when I did my MBA, and I had a very good professor in behavioral marketing, and he told me that not to insult used car salesmen, but the study after study had shown that used car salesmen had the same reputation as scientists. Well, being a young senior research scientist, I was kind of appalled and combative, to say the least, about saying, I don't think so. And he liked me. So he brought out all those studies. And, here I am 30 years later, and I'm like, you know what? The public probably had it right. I said, unfortunately for us in the scientific field. And you get that. I mean, I think that the damage to science by what's going on at CDC and NIH and FDA is off the charts because it's been politicized. And as a result, people don't trust these organizations. I think that's obvious. And they have good reasons to not trust them. If you listen to what I've had to say just about the mask issue. Yeah. And that's unfortunate because people do rely on these people for, good information. But right now it's questionable. I guess that's being kind.
You're making a really good point because the public trust or public faith in its institutions, I think, is completely destabilized, and it is unfortunate, especially for people who are scientists that do good work, to now suddenly be sort of guilt by association, in this circumstances is very unfortunate for people who've really taken pride in their careers and try to act with integrity. So you're making a point I hadn't considered before, but that's kind of a casualty of this whole circumstance, which is unfortunate.
And I've been in a number of trials on the stand. In fact, on the DuPont C8 trials, I was on the stand 12 days, 4 cases. And people criticize juries all the time. Well, they're blue collar or they're not educated or whatever. But I will say in cases whether we won or lost, I have a lot more faith in humanity than I probably did at one time sitting there in front of juries. And whether we won or lost, I could understand their decisions. I know there are rogue cases out there, but the public may not have all the initials after their names, but they have good common sense and they smell a rat. And I think in general, I have much more faith in the public than I might have when I was younger. In general, I think they figure it out. They may not have all the scientific reasons why, but they sense something isn't right.
Yeah.
And generally they're right.
I know that you have some slides that you feel like the visuals might be really informative for our audience. So if you don't mind, can you take us through those?
Sure, and bear with me as I slide through them. So the first one is sort of a macro slide, and this is sort of from 2020 to 2021. Remember, I don't think there's much argument about this, that CDC and other public health agencies were really concerned about surfaces as transmission and then droplets. And I'll say maybe they're starting to get religion on aerosols. I've always felt it was an aerosol issue, and I'm pretty sure I'm right. And this is a little busy, but this is a slide of where we're with time across the bottom and with cases per million. I think it's cases per million or 100,000 on the right. The upper line or slope is cases in Los Angeles. And you'll see that the mask in the red box is where they had mask mandates. And don't you know it, that the cases dropped like a rock right after the mask mandates? Not. They went up.
Wow.
And if you look at the lower curve, that's in Sweden, where they never had a mask mandate. So not only the cases went up, but they didn't peak nearly as badly on a normalized basis. And they never had masks. Now, I'll tell you a true story. This is a plot of cases in New York City versus mask mandate. Note that and this is what I call a disease progression curve. Most diseases have a situation where they take off, reach a point, and then they decay away. And I call it a disease progression curve. And so New York City imposed a mask mandate after we're already going down the backside of the curve, right? And there was a paper that came out that I pretty well trashed that looked at that point from April 17th down the line and said, see, we put masks on and look, the number of cases dropped like a rock. And I said, it had nothing to do with masks. You were in a disease progression curve and it was just dying out of naturally. So this is the kind of things you see going on. I want the audience to see the difference between a mask, these are masks on the left, and respirators on the right, N95 and a has face. And I say on the bottom, masks are not respirators, and the big difference is sealing. Even an N95 has troubles getting it sealed, but it's technically a respirator, but it's kind of a bottom of the barrel. And it's interesting when you look at, this is from the CDC website, and I blew it up, and they actually have a comparison of masks versus respirators, although I couldn't find it recently, but I have and anything I cite across the bottom, I make sure it's publicly available and I give you the URL. But know what it says about masks, and based on what I've already been saying to your audience. Does not prepare the wearer with a reliable level of protection from inhaling small airborne particles, aerosols, and is not respiratory protection. And then leakage occurs around the edges of the mask. Well, I've been saying this for months, and even CDC will admit it, but you got to go, they'll say, I recommend a mask, and then you got to go pages and pages in to find this sort of language. These are the effects that they quantify. They found in papers that quantify it. Internal diseases, COPD, it affects COPD, sleep apnea, renal failure, obesity, cardiopulmonary dysfunction, asthma. Then you've got the psychiatric issues, you've got the neurological issues, you got the ear, nose, and throat issues, dermatological issues, and pediatric disease issues. And in pediatrics, asthma, respiratory, we've talked about that, cardiopulmonary, neuromuscular, and epilepsy. So these are documented effects associated with mask wearing. It's interesting to note that even the WHO, the World Health Organization, says that one should do a risk analysis. And a risk analysis usually means, are the benefits of doing something outweighed by the benefits of not doing it? So if you wear a mask and say the benefits are that it stops disease, that would be, so let's say, or stops illness, then you look at how much illness is stopped. But on the other side, what kind of illnesses are created? Well, even the WHO says you got to do that before you issue a mask mandate. I've never seen somebody actually do that analysis of all these effects on the negative side in terms of a risk analysis. A true story here, this picture is a picture of, as I said before, N95s are the worst in these. This is yours truly in the middle of this graphic wearing a respirator on a plane. I almost got kicked off of 2 planes because I wore a respirator, half-face respirator. And they said that I had to wear a mask. And I said, well, that would unprotect me. I'm wearing a protective device and I'm an expert in this area. And the pilot said, well, we're going to have to kick you off the plane because you're not wearing a mask.
Wow.
And the only way that they allowed me to fly 2 times in a row was if I put a mask inside my respirator. How crazy.
You can't make this up.
You cannot make this up.
Wow.
And the only time I didn't wear my respirator, I got COVID.
Wow.
This graphic is very powerful in that it shows this black circle with the white inside represents a diameter of a human hair cross section. The red dot here isn't a COVID particle, it's a 1 micron particle. The COVID's 1/10 of that size.
Wow.
So I always ask people, can you get a human hair past the side of your mask? Well, if you can, those little guys are having a great time getting out.
Jeez.
And to compare things, visible dust is on the order of 50 microns, 500 times bigger or more. A thickness of a sheet of paper is about 100 microns for point of reference, or 1,000 times bigger than the viron. People say all the time, and this was work by Edwards, that we need to talk about droplets. Well, taking the data from Edwards, and this is across the top, days after infection, then the particles that are aerosols, the particles are droplets, and what percentage are aerosols. The -1 means this was before they were infected, the monkeys, the green monkeys. So a day before they're infected, they emit on this order about 11,000 particles versus aerosols versus 1.5 or so droplets. And then, as you would expect, as they're infected, they emit higher levels of aerosols or droplets. But the aerosols, based on that study, are always greater than 99.9% of the particles. And this is where they're plotted. And I'm like, how can you say that this is a disease about droplets? You can't.
Doesn't compute.
So what did they find? This is National Academy of Sciences Press 223/21. The majority of the particles exhaled in all subjects were aerosols. And that the very small droplets or aerosols would far exceed conventional social distances of 2 meters. Well, 2 meters is about 7 feet. And that this is the critical one. The exhaled aerosol numbers are a marker of disease in non-risk infected people. In other words, it's the little guys that cause the disease. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that I show people all the time, this was a plot looking at what happens if you have a hole in a mask, another gap. So what these folks, most of these studies, Drunick was an honest broker in the sense that he looked at the effectiveness of all kinds of mask materials. But these are always done with perfectly sealed masks on the mannequin or the fixture, and that's not reality. So he said, well, why don't I simulate gaps by putting small holes in the mask and seeing how effective they are? And what he did is he took holes as a percentage of the total mask area. He started with 0.5% area, then 1%, then 2% area. And what he found was that when he got to 2% of the area here on the right, that almost 75% down to 0.25 of the effectiveness of whatever it was lost. So I said to myself, well, that's interesting. This curve on these little particles looks pretty linear. Why don't I just project it out to see when I get to zero? And lo and behold, about 3% mask area, whatever effectiveness that mask had goes to zero. So then I asked the next question. Remember my infamous mask from Spirit Airlines? This is yours truly. I measured the gaps below the eyes, on either side of the nose, and then the little triangular area. And I found that that gap area was 9% of the mask area.
Wow.
Remember, if I get to 3, it's 0. No matter what this mask does, it could be 100% effective, which they never are.
Mm-hmm.
They're like 5 to 10%. So if that's 9%, that mask with those gaps has no effectiveness. Anyway, that's all I wanted. I could go on, but I won't bore you with the rest of this.
I think the visuals are very helpful, so thanks for sharing those. So this is an area, I think, of great contention, and I think in summarizing here, we have non-experts pontificating about it on an ongoing basis. We have confusing and contradictory information that's been coming out of the CDC and other agencies and individuals. So I'm very grateful for the fact that you, who has specialty expertise exactly in this arena, you have come to shed light on this, and that you're willing to speak publicly about it, because I know that that's probably bringing some heat and negativity toward you, from certain factions. So I appreciate the fact that you're doing this in general, and I appreciate the fact that you're spending time here with us right now.
You're welcome. I think it's important information to get out.
Well, hopefully that settles the mask issue for you. I know it did for me. Thanks for joining me for this interview with Stephen Petty.
If you speak out against a vaccine you don't think is safe, suddenly you're this anti-vaxxer, and it's become like conspiracy theorists. It's just a word to brainwash everybody that you're a Looney Tune if you ask for safety in your vaccines. Lockdown is not what we do in medicine. We talk about quarantine, and never once since time immemorial in Hippocrates have we quarantined the well. We always quarantine the sick, not the well. But lockdown, that's a term you use for prisoners. If somebody mandates you to put something in your body, then whether it's the government or your boss, then it means you don't own your body. They do.
And this is the first time in history of the 140 years of our pharmaceutical medical history in America that there's ever been a disease where we said, wait till you're really sick before you go get treated. Even a parent or a coach of a little league team without training of any kind. If a kid sprains their ankle, they don't look at that kid and go, you know what, you should wait 4 days till that gets really swollen and then ice it. There is going to be a huge outbreak is what it's going to look like. There's going to be a huge amount of autoimmune diseases, neurological diseases like ALS, Parkinson's, MS, that are going to be contributed directly to these shots. However, the time between the two of them is going to allow them to get away with liability.
Welcome to episode 8 of COVID Revealed. Well, we're a 9-part docuseries. This is episode 8 right now. So we're coming into that last little home stretch here. But let me tell you, we're not slowing down as we get there. There's a lot of powerful content yet to come. As a matter of fact, you might find that some of this content in episodes 8 and 9 might be the most important content for you in the whole series. Every piece of this matters. You need to hear and see this and to share it with other people. Before we jump in, I just want to remind you, while we're still in the free viewing period, that COVID Revealed is steeply discounted if you want to own it. Not only can you get the entire series, but there are special bonuses, attractive bonuses that I think you'll care about. If you did already invest in COVID Revealed, and so many have at this point, which encourages us like you can't imagine, thank you. But if you haven't, now's the time to take a look. See what's there, find the right package for you, and don't only revisit this information for yourself, but share it with other people so that they can learn it too. Episode 8 is a significant one, and it's coming up right now. Some months ago, my wife grabbed her phone and said, "Oh, you have to watch this doctor and hear what she has to say about COVID." And I'm watching this video of Dr. Lee Merritt, and I was absolutely engrossed. She was compelling, she was intelligent, she was focused, and what she had to say really drew me in. So when she said yes to us, when we sent out the invitation to interview her for this series, I was really excited. And now you get to hear the interview that I did with her, and let me tell you, she is not pulling any punches. She tells it like it is, and she's an extraordinarily courageous human being for doing so. Dr. Lee Merritt, thanks so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I'm really ambitious to hear your story, how one goes from an orthopedic and spine surgeon to to becoming a self-proclaimed rebel. Right. So if we can maybe start with your academic and professional background and career, and then we'll talk about how it got us to where we are right now.
Sure. Well, I trained at medical school, University of Rochester, School of Medicine and Dentistry in New York. I went off to the Navy and did an orthopedic residency, an internship in medicine at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And then decided instead, after 2 years with the fleet, I'd rather be an orthopedic surgeon. So I reapplied and was lucky enough to get in. So then I did that, and I finished that out. Was a Navy surgeon for basically 10 years. I went off to spine fellowship back at the University of Rochester. And then when I was out in private practice, my husband at the time was a Marine colonel at the Pentagon, and he said, "You should check out the Navy Research Advisory Committee. They need, by law, it's a congressional committee that needs a physician." And so I applied, and I spent, I think, 4 years doing that. And that kind of awakened me to some of the defense issues that we're faced with and kind of how to look at them. I've been in private practice, solo private practice, up until 2009, when I realized that doctors were becoming penned into hospitals through Obamacare. And I'm past president of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. And actually, we said that, we've been the voice of private practice since 1943. And I love that organization. It's the one I still belong to, because they fight for individual patient care, putting the patient first, not working for a big conglomerate. When you work for the government, you take the government dime, you take the government bidding. And I think that's what we're seeing happen here. So when this all broke out, I was semi-retired. I was doing a little orthopedics on the side, but I had a little practice down in Omaha, Nebraska, doing laser therapies, totally unrelated to orthopedics. It was just kind of a entrepreneurial fling. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, we need to go down, and why don't you come with us? We need a physician to talk against the mask mandate that's coming out." I said, "Sure, that should be a slam dunk, because there's no science demonstrating the masks work. That should be easy." So I went down there, and I realized I was facing the entire University of Nebraska, virology, infectious disease, epidemiology, CEO, everybody. They were all over on the other side. I couldn't believe it. And that kind of got me into this, because that video went, that little 3-minute spiel, at which I kind of looked around and I said, anybody that believes in masks as a therapy for this, or as a preventive measure, is either being paid or being played. And that kind of got some viral airtime, including it ended up on that, how Alex Jones does that first couple minutes, sometimes he just puts on a random video, and it was mine, which then Simone Gold called me to join the American Frontline Doctors and give the mask speech. So I'm still, 18 months later, my mask talk is still on banned.video as one of the more banned videos around. I got banned immediately. It got taken down immediately when it got put up after the speech at AFLDS. So that's how I really got into this, because you have to ask yourself, what's about the mask that they have to do that? And the answer is it's key to the psychological operation that's COVID. I'm actually giving a talk in, just in a couple weeks at the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons in Pittsburgh. And, it's COVID, the grand delusion. I'm not saying that there isn't something out there. I believe it's a bioweapon that started this whole thing. I'm not saying there isn't a problem out there. But most of what we're seeing now, most of what has happened to us has been due to a great mass trauma mind control type psyop that has just taken over the world. And that's what we have to fight probably at first. I mean, look at what looking at what the masks are doing to our children. That was my major point when I gave that talk, is that you and I, adults, we're not going to be completely destroyed by the mask. We're just going to get mad that we have to wear it if we're normal people. Now, what has happened though is they put them on children, and now children's psychological development that is critical. Seeing each other's human face is critical to development of children. That's being damaged. And I had one of the other AFLDS doctors, Dr. McDonald, is a pediatric psychiatrist. And I asked him at dinner one night, I said, if we stop this masking of children right now, will our kids be okay? And he said, no, we've got some permanent damage that's happened. And that's probably that was my biggest first foray into this. Now, I'd also written a published article on hydroxychloroquine. Has the truth about viral treatment been suppressed for decades? Something like that. I can't remember the exact title. I wanted to write it as the biggest lie, but they wouldn't accept that title, and I can never remember the one they made me put on there. So, but it's about that, because I look back in 1974, we knew that hydroxychloroquine had the potential to do what it's doing for this disease. We saw it, we saw it being useful for SARS. I mean, quite frankly, in January of last year, we already were on Lyme doctors all over the world, and we were hearing the Chinese and the Koreans and the Indians, people talking about hydroxychloroquine. They were more familiar with it because they'd faced this before, and they were all starting to use it. But then it came to America, and it was just shot down the minute that President Trump said something about it. I thought, oh, that's Orange Man bad. Well, it wasn't. It was more than that, because here we have people dying, and they're still lying about it. They're still saying we don't know anything about this. I mean, it got to be very obvious they were lying. I mean, the biggest one was the fake article that, well, to back up, there was a big international study that showed countries that used hydroxychloroquine early and often, when this first thing broke out, had 75% less death than countries that didn't. It was huge numbers, and it was all across the world. And we see now that, India's gone back to using it. Japan is officially using it. I think there's another couple countries that are officially using it. And yet we still are lying about it. You got to ask yourself why. So I wrote this article about, the cover up. And I found that, I came to the conclusion it wasn't just about this disease, or it wasn't just about President Trump. One of the arguments, when I found a paper that said hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, a potent inhibitor of influenza A in vitro, meaning we could treat the flu with this. I said, oh, that's what it is. $69 billion vaccine industry goes to zero with these things, because it's not just this drug. There are other drugs that are like this. No, I don't think that was it either. I think it turned out to be that you can't terrorize an entire world's population if we know we have safe treatment. And you can't get an emergency use authorization for a vaccine if you have a treatment. That's what that was all about. But what you ask yourself, same with the mask, what you ask yourself is, it takes a lot of juice at a high level to suppress that knowledge for 40 years. And that's what happened. It wasn't published. It was suppressed from being talked about. I talked to medical students that never heard that we could treat viruses with antimicrobial agents. I talked to my friend in 40 some years as a professor of medicine, never heard that. So no, there are big high level things going on running this show.
Yeah, anything that seems to be related to early treatment is, immediately kind of shut down, vilified, and anybody who tries to propose it is, killing people because you're creating vaccine hesitancy. I think to your point earlier, if anybody thought that there might be a hope for early intervention that showed promise, who's going to go take an experimental vaccine, right? So it seems it seems like it's gotten kind of crazy in this respect. But in your past, prior to the current scenario, I don't see anything in your Vita that says you were sort of this rebellious, outspoken physician surgeon. So obviously something brought you out to speak up publicly, and now you're starting to discuss what that is. That you're seeing things are amiss here. Have you ever seen anything like this before in your medical career?
No, but in my 45 years of medicine, if I look back on it now in just a life, I think what we've been seeing are all the building blocks being put in place for this. I really think this is an extinction level event that's being thrown at the world, and it's against us. This is an attack on humanity in general, not about America, not about Japan. It's we might be the focus right now because we're the most likely to stand up, but I think it's against everybody, all humans, and we need to realize that.
For sure. And, it's interesting, as you discuss some of your experience in the military and in and around, the Pentagon. Do you have any speculation around what's driving all this? As far as, do you think that everybody's complicit from, the legislators right on down to, FDA, NIH, Health and Human Services, or are they useful idiots? How do you see it?
I know. And this is why it's so effective, because what's happening to us is so hard to believe. It's such a big lie that is hard to believe. And the other thing, people can't believe a huge conspiracy. The argument is, how can that many people get together and cooperate? Well, the point is you don't need that many people. Mm-hmm. First of all, look at Enron. I mean, how many people below the top people knew the corruption that was going on there? No, it's just a few at the top can run the show to do things that are bad, and most people are unaware. So the idea that you need to have a huge number of people that are in the know to run a huge conspiracy is wrong. But here's the thing I tell people. Think about what happened in 2020. We had a test I personally think this started with a man-made pathogen, a man-made bioweapon that was released. I can't prove how or why it was released, but I don't think it was an accident, but I can't prove that. And that was deadlier than the rest of the year. I mean, there were things that happened that made me think if that had continued, we would have had 2 million people die by July. I was graphing death per day since December. And I noticed that it was going up hyperbolically, but it stopped. It just became another flu season. I mean, another winter season of death. We always have this bell-shaped curve of death in the winter. No worse than that after the first. But what then happened is we brought out these tests. Now, these tests were devised in 3 centers: the Drosten test and the Louis Pasteur Institute and the CDC. They all had their little proprietary test, but it was made commercially by commercial manufacturers that had guidebooks. And in these guidebooks, it clearly states, I looked at the Thermo Fisher and another one, it clearly states you cycle these tests from 20 to 30 times. If you go over 30 times, what will happen? You will get some false positives. If you go over 35 times, you're going to get so many false positives. And if you look at the guidebooks, it shows it in the term of an S-shaped graph, that once you go over 35, you start getting on the flat part of the top of the S. It's meaningless. It's not just that these tests are a little bit wrong. They're so wrong, they're at the level of the broken clock tells the right time twice a day. They should have been thrown out, and they should not have been done that way. But you have to ask yourself, these are lab managers that set these tests up. These are highly trained professionals that know what they're doing. They know how to set up tests. They know how to train their staff, and they know how to check for false positive, false negative rate. They know how to quality control their work. So why is it that all over the world, these lab managers all did it wrong? And they all did it wrong in the same direction. None of them undercycled the test, right? It wasn't just accidental. They all overcycled the test. And the final coup de grace is that on the magic date of January 21st, they all cycled correctly. Now, they started down cycling. So what happened there? So you have in my opinion, there are only 2 worldviews. And if the people watching this decide there's a third, I'd love to hear from you. The first worldview is that in 2020, for some reason, we had a group psychosis of lab managers, that they all had some kind of brain hissy fit, were connected together somehow and told to, oh, overcycle the tests, you know? I don't know. They all had a brain psychosis. The other one is somebody told them to overcycle the tests. And who could that somebody be? It can't be the CEO of some university hospital. It can't, because it was all hospitals, and it can't be like the state of Utah because it was all states. And it can't be the United States because it was all countries for the most part in the Western world. So it, by definition, this has to be a transnational or international conspiracy. A conspiracy by definition is 2 to 3 people, you know, more than 2 people, in other words, that get together to do something that is bad for somebody else. We don't talk about a conspiracy to have a surprise birthday party. It's only a conspiracy when we're going to assassinate somebody or do something bad. So by definition, this is an international conspiracy. I can't come up with another worldview because I really don't buy into the group psychosis of lab manager theory.
Well, what's interesting, to your point about the PCR test is that, number one, it gets emergency use authorization from the CDC. Number two, as you said, the amplification cycles, they make them they rig them to give a bunch of positive tests, so it looks like there's a pandemic going on, all these infected people. Number three, they lower the cycles once it looks like they want to see that it's going down and vaccines introduced. Look, the vaccine's working, and then where I'm incredulous is, and then they say at the end of this year they're revoking the emergency use authorization for the tests that we shut down the world based on. So there's, you can't look at this and say this is normal course of intelligent thinking around the circumstances that were dealt with. Yet there's a sufficient amount of complexity in understanding all this that it keeps people ignorant and reading headlines. And
it's not by accident that we're ignorant. It's not by accident that we're confused. We have not done one thing that we would do normally to figure out what's going on. If this were a real pandemic, if this had been a real disease that they didn't know anything about, and it was sweeping the world like it appeared to be, what are some of the things we should have done? Well, we should have really documented those patients. Okay, we might have done some of that. And then the ones that we thought died of this new mystery disease, they should have had autopsies. We should have been doing a lot of autopsies. This is what we did, in the pandemic of 1918. Dr. William Welch from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology came out to Kansas and went to Fort Riley, Kansas, and started doing autopsies very bravely because he didn't know what was happening. He brought a crew of other pathologists, and they went out and started doing these young recruits that were dying. And they found some things that clearly were not viral induced. I mean, they found, for example, here's one that they found that you don't hear much, that the lungs were filled with blood. Well, it turns out that, these guys were coughing and they had inflamed lungs, but Bayer aspirin had lost its patent at that point. And we also have a lot of documents from those times of observations, what happened. We're keeping these diaries so we know what happened for the future. So our future generations. And that's what they did. So you can go back and read these. And Bayer had lost their patent. And so they were advising doctors, and doctor societies had taken this up, that when you have a fever, you should just keep taking aspirin until it got the fever down. Well, these doctors were seen giving handfuls of aspirin to these young men. So what happened is, to some of them, they just bled out. Wow. That was, and so, we learned a lot, but we still didn't. And then the next thing they did was look at transmission. They tried to prove transmissibility, and interestingly, they couldn't prove it. But at least they did the right things. This is what you should have done, and this is what we should have done here. We should have, done autopsies so we actually know what we're dealing with. For example, if we did 100 people that hospital A says are all dead of COVID, and then we take those people and we farm them out anonymously to other hospitals, and we get blinded autopsy reports. What did this person die of? Then we'll see. Because if we found that 60% of them actually died of influenza, and another 20% had bronchial pneumonia and blah, 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 you don't know, because we never did that.
right.
But there's no pathognomonic sign for COVID. I mean, yes, there's some things that we look at. I mean, here I am, an orthopedic surgeon treating COVID just because I morally feel obligated to try to help people so they don't go to the hospital, which has not been proven to be a good thing to do. But there are some things. So the taste and smell, you can get that with flu and other things, but that's one. If you have people that have a dry hacking cough and some chest pain and low O2 more than you would anticipate, severe fatigue, and this loss of taste and smell, that's kind of a collection of things. Type A blood puts you at more risk. So there's kind of a constellation of signs and symptoms that we associate with this disease, but we still don't know what we're dealing with. And now we have a completely false test. So no autopsies, no pathognomonic sign, no false test. And the crowning jewel in this unknown, shifting sand world is not having a viral isolate. Mm-hmm. Now, I just when I heard that periodically over the last 18 months, I just dismissed it. I said, oh no, they got to have an isolate. And come on, how can they not? And then you saw that video of a guy coming out of a lab PhD in California saying, no, the CDC can't apply an isolate. Now, I couldn't prove that, but now it's come out, yes, that's true. The CDC doesn't have an isolate. 90 countries don't have an isolate. God love him, Patrick King up in Alberta forced Ms. Hinshaw, the chief medical advisor of the province, to admit she didn't have an isolate. So this whole thing has been made, and I finally looked at it myself. Not that I have the complete skills to like a virologist, but if I talked to Andy Kaufman. If you look at how they did this, it's called an in silico genome. In other words, they didn't get it because they really did an isolate of the virus. They got it because they manufactured little fragments, put them together in a computer model, and decided that it was close to SARS. So then they started looking at SARS, and it came out to be SARS-CoV-2. They filled in some holes. You're talking about a computer-generated genome to some degree. And when they started, they selected out only 150 base pair fragments to put together. Now, that's a huge jigsaw problem because they claim this virus is 30,000 base pairs. Mm. So it's not the whole thing is shifting sand. We know nothing really about this disease. It's not too late. They could still do the right thing, but it appears that that's the other point I would make. When you look at this being a conspiracy or not, and how big, it appears, let's just take our CDC and NIH and Dr. Fauci. They did not say one thing in our benefit. One thing. They didn't really say one thing. They could have said things like, hey, we know about vitamin D. We've known about it for 3 decades. Japanese studies showed that it helped decrease flu better than vaccination. Start taking vitamin D. I mean, there's so much evidence for vitamin D, and they didn't say that. They could have told us about hydroxychloroquine because clearly they knew. He admitted it. We found out, study where he said it before that he thought it was a good idea. But no, this time he went out of his way to say no. And then all the confusion. So they really did. I mean, here's another one. Besides vitamin D, there's zinc. Yeah. But just to show you about the vitamin D, the Indonesians looked at it. They had 800 people in a hospital study, and they looked at how many hospitalized patients. What's the difference between that small minority that go to the ICU and die versus everybody else who gets well and walks away? And they showed that the biggest contributor was vitamin D level. 30 or above, your chance of going to the ICU is less than 5%, actually less than 4%. So for all its billions of dollars of funding, where's the CDC? You got to be a little suspicious about that. And then whenever people did find out things that helped, they were harassed. Dr. Naputi, a chiropractor that does naturopathic medicine. And what happened to him in St. Louis? He was completely attacked by the FDA and others for advertising we should be using vitamin D. Are you kidding me? I mean, it's just not right.
No, and he's not the only one. Yeah,
No,
yeah. I mean, there's been a lot. Anybody who suggests that there might be a natural way and an inexpensive way, and not even saying this is a cure for COVID, but this is a way to help prevent it, a way to get healthier. There's no adverse effects of taking vitamin D or zinc or vitamin C. So, but yet it's completely. It's like a viciously prosecuted if you start to. I have another friend of mine in Dallas who's a chiropractor who literally they raided his office. I mean, they came because he had, and he didn't say COVID. He's just saying, I have these varying vitamins. They help support your immunity, etc. Boom, they came in and just terrified him. It was pretty extraordinary. So we're seeing this left and right, vicious attacks. We see the White House calling out U.S. citizens on a dirty dozen list. I mean, that's unprecedented also.
Disinformation doesn't. Yeah,
Yeah,
one of my friends is, well, a bunch of my friends now are on that list.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then look at now, we know that ivermectin works. India has shown clearly that ivermectin was the key to their lack of death compared to us. Japan just had a huge study, showed that it worked. It cut down on the days of being ill, and they've now recommended officially. And what are we doing? When desperate patients now are ordering ivermectin from overseas, from the Indian pharmacies, and it's being shipped to them, the FDA has gotten the U.S. Postal Service to interdict it at the border, so that our citizens cannot get it at any.
And that's another level. It's one thing to say we don't recommend this, we don't recognize it as an effective treatment, but now saying we're cutting off access to it, and this is an over-the-counter drug in Mexico.
That's right. I used to live on the Mexican border. We had, and this, it's a bigger. There's a bigger issue here of the fact that we have a Politburo style medical system where we have a group of a couple of people in the FDA that can determine what 330 million people in America may have. Are we free people when we don't have the option to just go down and buy things over the counter? And by the way, if you look at the worst death rate, when I gave a talk in August of last year in about COVID and the rise of medical technocracy, and it was out in Las Vegas. So I looked at the worst place to be and the best place to be. I mean, the idea is you not only want to know your overall survivability, which was 99.97% at the time. I mean, it wasn't bad odds even for Vegas. But where's the worst place to be? Well, the worst death rate was New York State, where I trained, 0.17% per capita. Where was the best death rate? Uganda. Okay, not a place known as a medical tourism spot. But in Uganda, you're free enough to walk down to the corner store and buy ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine over the counter. Wow. So one of the things that everybody should know by now is that early treatment matters. That you don't wait until your partial, your oxygen pulse oximetry reads 75. You need to be treated early, and the earlier you're treated, the quicker it goes away. Right. And so the problem is, they were turning people away, and by the time you get to a doctor, it might be too late. Whereas if it's over the counter, it's fine. And do you know that the governors of every state have the opportunity and the authority to make those drugs over the counter?
I guess that's true, because if it's intra-state, then the FDA would have no jurisdiction, right? So now that's actually a very good point. I hadn't thought of that before. I wonder if some of them are considering it. Hopefully, yes.
No, I don't think so. And I brought it to several of their attentions. And I've been speaking publicly about that. In Oklahoma, the governor actually gave away the government supplied hydroxychloroquine he was given. I don't know why, but because I don't know if it's a FEMA thing or something. He got a big supply of hydroxychloroquine, and they were thinking about burning it. And I told his assistant, I said, don't do that. When we get the next round of this, you're going to look really bad if you do that. But they didn't burn it, but they gave it away. I mean, I don't know. See, that makes you, when you try to say who's involved in this, there's a lot of money involved. And I don't know if it's just the money, if it's threatening people, but this is a big takedown, and it has to be at a national level. It's not just our nation.
Well, I think I've heard other experts say that it's almost incomprehensible that every nation in the world had an infectious disease playbook. They were all different, nation by nation, and that they all just summarily threw out their playbook and adopted the same one instantaneously. That's sort of suspect also. It doesn't quite add up or make sense. Have there been, we're talking about the autopsy thing. I'm wondering, because a lot of people are also looking at that and scratching their heads saying, how are they not performing autopsies and trying to learn? And I'd seen articles of pathologists speaking out saying, please let us do autopsies on these people and let us see if we can learn something that might be helpful, but it's not being done. Have any been done that you know of, or any maybe internationally in other countries, have they been doing them?
Well, I know that when it first started, I know that China did a couple, because one of the, they're actually, when it first started and I was watching it, there were 3 groups of people, not just 2. There were the vast majority of the Chinese, even in Wuhan, that walked away from this thing. Either they didn't get sick or they didn't get really sick, or whatever, they recovered. That was the vast majority. Then there was the group that went to the ICU and died. Okay. But there was a third group that nobody seems to talk about. And that were these young men that were just mostly young men. I saw one woman, but there were films of these people just dropping over on the street. I mean, they were dead when they hit the ground. You know that they were unconscious because they didn't even put out their hands and they hit with their faces on the sidewalks. Now, you can't get an actor to do that. Who were they? Well, there were a couple autopsies done on them. I saw or heard of two of them, and they said they died of overwhelming sepsis and cardiac failure. Now that, I remember the exact terms because it perked my ears up, because that was what the animals died from when they tried a coronavirus vaccine on cats, and they died of antibody-dependent enhancement, which they called immune enhancement back then when they did the studies. This was a long time ago. They said what happened was you gave the vaccine to the cat and they did fine. But then when they were challenged with the virus that they were being vaccinated against, it created this very unusual overshoot situation, and they died of, quote, overwhelming sepsis and cardiac failure. And so I think that's when I heard that, I thought, I wonder what this relationship is to the SARS. We never vaccinated people for SARS, presumably in this country, but the word on the street was that they had tried vaccines on humans back then. Now, that these could have been former military recruits, and that virus hasn't been around. The trigger hasn't been around until now, and it dropped those guys. Yeah. I kind of think that's maybe what happened, but I know about that group. We know we also have some pathology now, at least one or two on a post-vaccination death, where it shows spike protein everywhere, including in the brain. So I have a feeling that if we did, we'd see something like that. I'm sure, actually, there's several doctors that died. I'm sure they got autopsies. I haven't seen them, but I'm sure that it's somebody knows. That I don't know. But that's what we don't have enough, and we don't have it collated enough. The Russians published a book that I can no longer find, but they had a little booklet that they published of autopsies, showing inflammation and spike protein in various organs.
Yeah, and the theory was it's not supposed to travel around the body, right? It's supposed to kind of stay local. And if they're finding that it's happening in the brain in other places, then it's not behaving the way they anticipated.
Well, when it comes to these so-called vaccines that really aren't vaccines, they're viral-based genetic therapies. They never once believed it stayed in the arm. And all these guys that say, well, we helped devise this, or we were vaccine researchers, said they didn't know. I'm not buying that, because honestly, like I say, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I'm not this is my business. But way back when it was before the web got scrubbed of some of this stuff, Novavax they manufacture the Matrix M, which is the coating that goes around the genetic material to make this vaccine. Now keep in mind, these things were made to be genetic agents, like for genetic therapy or for gene therapy for cancer. So they had to target the area that they wanted treated. They didn't want it to go all over. And they said with this Novavax Matrix M, they could target it. So if they wanted to go in the kidney, they could make it go in the kidney. You don't want your cancer treatment for the kidney being dropped into the heart, Right. So they claimed they could target these things. So now to say that we didn't know it went outside the arm, you can't have this for genetic therapy that doesn't go outside the arm. Are you kidding me? So I don't know how anybody's getting away with saying we didn't know. That's to me kind of suspicious.
And looking at adverse events, I was actually this morning I was reviewing some footage. People are going out and trying to document the adverse events, because it seems like it's underreported. It's never talked about. We're trying to interview people for this series. So we have the quote unquote on the ground intelligence, meaning a lot of people can talk about biostatistics and the data and the numbers and and implications, but when, for example, locally here, a mother of two, single mom, nurse, is going to lose her job if she doesn't get the vaccine. She doesn't want it. She's compelled to do it, otherwise she can't feed her kids. Gets her first dose, very sick, hospitalized actually, but still she's forced to go back for her second dose, and it kills her. And you're not seeing this reported anywhere. And of course, anybody does, it's getting either edited at best, or it's being suppressed and censored. So yeah, it's pretty disturbing. Do you have any views on just the adverse events reporting as far as the state of it right now, and is it much worse than what we think?
Oh, it is much worse than what we think. But to back up in history here a little bit, again, this didn't start here. They've been setting the stage for a long time. And I'm not saying that 30 years ago they knew they were going to bring out this particular vaccine or this vaccine program. It's not really a vaccine, but I'm going to say that they have been the psychological operation was in full force. So, for example, if I'm a doctor, I mean, 20 years ago, if I'm a doctor and I say, and I don't want to name any real blood pressure medicines because I'm really not against atenolol or lisinopril. There are many, but blood pressure medicine X, I don't think is safe. Okay. And I say that, I'll tell you what, okay, so here's a real example. When all those, I was a big user of Celebrex in Southern Arizona when I was in practice for a number of years. In fact, the biggest user in Southern Arizona, because I had a big spine practice. When Vioxx came out, it had been studied for 15 years by the FDA. This tells you that this doesn't make you safer. 15 years in the FDA, and it was approved. Now, so people wanted to try it. I said, okay, we'll try it on some people. We started using it. And within 3 weeks, I told my office manager, we're not using this. There's something wrong with this drug. People's ankles are swelling up and they're telling me their blood pressure goes up. And then she was getting calls. I said, okay, I want you to call everybody we put it on, tell them we don't think it's safe and that you should get off this. We'll put you on something else. It's similar. It took the FDA 3 more years before they figured out that was true and they took this thing off the market, Vioxx. Now, my point in this is, if I had been speaking out very publicly against Vioxx, nobody would have accused me of being some kind of, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, or I don't know what you would call that.
Right.
But if you speak out against a vaccine you don't think is safe, suddenly you're this anti-vaxxer, and it's become like conspiracy theorists. It's just a word. The intelligence services know how to do this. It's just a word to, brainwash everybody that you're a Looney Tune if you ask for safety in your vaccines. Okay, that's been going on for a very, very long time. I looked at, being a libertarian bent, I looked at, the nurses came to me when they were being forced to take the flu vaccine. And I found out horrendous things about the flu vaccine that clearly were not being talked about. And the lack of benefit. For example, Estonia, 5% of people are vaccinated with the flu. They have 0.02% mortality each year they consider from the flu. In America, 67% on average are vaccinated for the flu. We have 0.02% mortality from the flu. See any difference? The difference is we take all the risk. Flu vaccine is the #1 payout in the government compensation board for vaccines. And it's for the same things we're seeing with this one. But here's the difference. In 31 years of the VAERS, the vaccine adverse event reporting system that was set up by the CDC for one reason. It was set up to look for unusual events or unusual trends that would in post-marketing of a drug would trigger us to think about halting the rollout if there's a problem, right? Now, in 31 years of this VAERS system, there were roughly, I think it was like 5,000 deaths, less than 5,000 deaths, I think, reported to VAERS for vaccine injury of all vaccines put together. And we are already at 6,700, and it's probably being suppressed because if you look at the VAERS numbers, they've started going up fairly rapidly, and then it's kind of plateaued, kind of like the gold market. Somebody's got their thumb on the VAERS numbers. They're not letting it out. We know it's a lot more than that. But even those, it's more than 31 years of all vaccines put together. Don't you think that should say something? I looked at when a doctor in Florida died of a thromboembolic event. What happened was he was an OBGYN doctor, 50s years, 56, I think, perfect health. He gets his Pfizer vaccine and he starts having some spontaneous bleeding. So he goes and gets a lab study and finds he has 0 platelets. That's what caught my attention to this article, because that's not something we usually see. And the second bad part of it is he was in his own hospital and they were trying to treat him and he was dead in 12 days of a brain bleed. So trust me, they tried to treat this guy. Now we have diseases like idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura. It's called ITP or TTP. And generally what happens is the platelets drop down to a dangerous level for whatever reason. We supplement the platelets, we keep you going until we can figure out what's going on. And often we can, over 50% of the time, at least in younger people, we can turn it around. We can figure out what's going on and stop it. But here, there were 37 other cases like that right at that time. I started pulling cases of people that just were sudden bleeding deaths, and they are all over the place. And here's the problem. You're 75 years old, and it usually starts within 4 days of the vaccination, by the way. This is very useful. It's very common. So what happens is you're 75 years old, you get your COVID vaccine, and a couple days later, you go into the hospital and die with a massive hemorrhage to the brain. Well, unfortunately, they just say, oh, 75-year-old dies with massive hemorrhage to the brain. It's not unusual, right? Because it tends to be age related, even though he wasn't terribly old. It does happen to 29-year-olds, but not as often. So they're seeing it, and they're saying when a 75-year-old goes in with it, they don't count it as a COVID vaccine problem. Do you see what I'm saying? And there's a lot of those things. But if you take any diagnosis, myocarditis, Guillain-Barré is probably the most common side effect we have, mostly on the basis of the flu vaccine. And I actually have some numbers, but it's like roughly 100 some cases a year. And what they have now is they have over 1,400 cases in 8 months.
Wow.
That's the difference. And you do that with almost anything. Here's one in the military. In 2020, they only had 20 deaths of COVID in all the military services, but they're vaccinating everybody. And they have an epidemiologic data bank that shows they have over, and myocarditis is something, because it is a disease that tends to hit younger men, and they do get all sorts of vaccines. So we're already probably killing some people with the flu vaccine in that population. And other vaccines, just the battery that they're given. We are still seeing 600 excess myocarditis cases this year than we've seen before, which with a 66%, I think it's roughly 66% 5-year mortality. We've killed 20 times more people than COVID did. So risk benefit, none of this makes sense. None of this makes sense if they're really concerned about our health and welfare. And then, don't you love the psychological operation saying, well, yes, I know you got two doses of the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna, whichever one. You got your vaccination, you're fully vaccinated, but yes, you still got COVID because it's those darn unvaccinated people, or it's the Delta variant. My friend says if you believe in the Delta variant, you believe you're a member of the Lambda Delta Nu fraternity for morons. You don't have to have a variant to explain what's happening. When as the vaccine rate went up, the death rate went up. When Dr. Seligman and his partner, who's an engineer, last name Yativ, Seligman's an epidemiologist at the University of Marseille in France, but they're both Israeli citizens, dual citizens. So they looked at the data coming out of Israel early on. Israel's the perfect petri dish. It's all Pfizer, one country, almost universal vaccination. So that's like we should really be paying attention. Now, you notice governments always say they have a magic psychological number. 95% is 95% effective. That's what the CEO of Pfizer said to ABC News, like the day before the rollout, when we couldn't even get the EUA data. It was like 95% effective. So 95% is a magic number, but it's not real. Right. So they looked at what was happening in Israel, and they took the government numbers and they ran them knowing how to do it. Okay. And it showed that at a time when 12.5% of the population was vaccinated, 51% of the COVID deaths, the deaths of the disease that we're trying to prevent, were in vaccinated people. And that if you look by age, if you were over 65, you had a 40 times increased risk of dying of COVID than if you hadn't taken the vaccine.
Wow.
Now, unfortunately, the numbers that and in other countries, they're seeing this. The British chief medical officer, I think, just said that 70 to 80% of the people in their ICU and being very sick from COVID are vaccinated. And we're hearing that from other countries. But what are we doing in the United States? Again, believe this is accidental. We've decided to count vaccinated. You're only considered vaccinated if it's 2 weeks after your last vaccine.
Correct.
So you can have one dose, and you could be 5 weeks after that dose with another dose on board and not be considered vaccinated.
Yeah.
And that's crazy when you think that the damage is happening within the first 4 days for many people.
Yeah, it's disturbing, as the data comes out. And as you said, we have to look really kind of to Israel as compared to what data is coming from here, because we can't, I think there's too many contradictions. We can't really trust the data. It seems like the disposition is the ends justifies the means. So we have this sort of goal in mind, this end in mind, which is a submissive, fully vaccinated, society. And if we have to lie about adverse events, we have to lie about effectiveness, we have to lie about anything, as long as it doesn't create vaccine hesitancy, then we're morally justified in our actions, which of course is the opposite of informed consent, and the opposite of liberty.
Or the other option is it's really not about our safety. They're not doing it because they think it's a greater good. They want us all vaccinated for another reason. And again, this is just speculative, but it's speculative based on history. Okay. There are always people in history, back to the time of Plato, who said there were too many people and we need to control them through disease and war and other things. That's been said. Plato said that in the Republic. Okay, so there are always the overlords who are nervous when populations get too big, and I'm just going to point that out. That's just a historical point. And then you look at the basic science. What have they been working on? Don't just look at the medical science, because that may not tell you things, but look at the basic science when you look at what they've been working on. And one of the things is, this is in Australia, this was done. They wanted to get rid of the mice population. And so they created these self-disseminating vaccines, self-disseminating. So, and they were immunocontraceptives. They were self-disseminating vaccines that went to the ovaries of mice and sterilized them. So they would capture some mice, they would vaccinate them, they'd become sterile. The female mice's ovaries were destroyed. Then they would let them back into the wild, and they would go out and they would rub up against other mice, and they would shed on those mice. SHED, shed.
Yeah.
And the shedding would then transfer that vaccine to those mice that would then become sterile, and they'd transfer it to another group of mice that would become sterile. And so they can sterilize a huge population from just trapping a smaller population. Now, what are we seeing with this vaccine? Well, I already mentioned that this vaccine in the Japanese study collected 64 times in the ovary versus the rest of the body. So I can't help but think, conjecture that that's a targeted organ. I just can't help it. And if you can ignore that maybe, but it's not the only organ it was going to, but it's one of the three big top ones. The second part is we've had problems with what we've called shedding before we knew that there was a formal term for it.
Right.
People were starting to talk about, hey, I went back to work and all the people around me are vaccinated, but I'm not, and I just keep getting sick. And then other people are saying, I go back to work and I haven't had a menstrual period in 5 years, and suddenly I'm bleeding again. Or little girls are bleeding when they're too young, or women of childbearing age are having all sorts of random menstrual periods and things. And what does that imply? That kind of bleeding problem implies damage to the reproductive health of women. Now, it doesn't appear to be airborne. When you look at it, I never heard anybody tell me that that they're completely homebound, but they go to the grocery store and they suddenly start having this. No, it's usually with people in your office that are vaccinated, your husband, somebody in your household, that's the kind of thing. Close contact, going back to school or being a nurse where everybody else around you is vaccinated. That caused it. Now, we were trying to talk about this, hoping somebody would pipe up and give us some help. We never heard anything from FDA or the vaccine people. Nobody volunteered any information, but I found one that in 2008, the European Medicines Agency had a seminar, a PowerPoint presentation type seminar on vaccine, viral-based genetic therapy shedding. Remember, that's what these are called. That's how we learned it, is from this data. VBGTs, that's what these things are. And it talked exactly about shedding. In 2015, the FDA published a circular exactly about how to deal with shedding. And it was written, remember, it wasn't about, they didn't call them vaccines because they didn't plan on making this into a vaccine. This was genetic therapy and cancer therapy. And they said, when you're doing the studies on these patients, make sure you protect the people around them, because they can shed these toxic particles on them. And we think people at risk are neonates, the elderly, and the immunocompromised. Wow. They also said, and this should make everybody comfortable when you consider that they rolled out these vaccines to the whole friggin' world before they decided that they, before doing any long-term studies. They said, we don't really know what's coming off the vaccinated people or off the injected people. We know that it could be genetic, it could be viral, and it could be a combination. Aren't you comforted by that? We have a Frankenstein nanoparticle being shed from vaccinated people that they don't really know, but they think these people should be protected. But did they tell us? No, of course not. And you know, there's been tragedies. I know of one case where a physician who was retired, not elderly, but older, had his elderly mother living with him. She didn't go anywhere. She wasn't connected with anybody else. He gets the Johnson & Johnson vaccine thinking he's going to protect his mother. He gets sick for 3 days and she dies of COVID.
Wow.
You know, 6-month-old baby that's breastfeeding successfully for all this time. Mother gets the Pfizer vaccine. Baby dies of this weird thrombocytopenia because it gets transmitted in the breast milk or something.
And
we do know, you asked about pathology. We do know that another thing about the first people that have died after the vaccine, one of the pathologies showed that there were spike proteins, particles in all the hair follicles, which goes along with this being sweat out, you know, coming out in your body fluids. So I can't look at that and not think, and creepily, when it came to Australia and the mice, they also published a paper, a mathematical type basis paper, to decide how many, to show you how you could calculate how many people you needed to vaccinate in order to diminish the population by, I said people, wasn't that a Freudian slip? How many mice you need to vaccinate in order to decrease the population by this percentage. It's all been worked out. I mean, I don't mean to sound paranoid, but I think somebody, you know, I'm not the only one saying this. Dr. Zelenko, I had to call him about something, and he said this is programmed genocide, which I did have a little chuckle to that. Like, what's unprogrammed genocide? You just wake up one morning and want to kill the whole world. You know, but he's right. And this is a culling. This is being used to kill a bunch of people. I cannot come up with a reason. Who in their right mind? Now think about how this vaccine works. These vaccines work. You're claiming you give this to the immune infirm people, elderly people that need help because their own immune system is not working well. But then you give them a vaccine that works by taking over their genetic machinery and producing trillions of the spike protein, which makes people sick with COVID. How can that possibly be good thinking if you really want to help the elderly?
There's a lot of things that just don't add up, right? And I think you know, I just love the way that you're kind of looking at things, saying this doesn't make sense, and that doesn't make sense, and this doesn't make sense, and some of it is actions or, you know, things of commission, but also suspect is the omissions, right? What they're not doing, you know, and then you start to piece this together, and to your point, it's like you're saying, hey, it's not like you were somebody that was a member of a tinfoil hat club, you know, for a lot of years, you know, with conspiracy theories. You were a very traditional practicing orthopedic surgeon, and but you're literally at obviously great peril to your own reputation, coming out and saying something's really wrong here, and these things don't add up. And you know, you've obviously done your research. I mean, you've been looking, you've been reading, and this has been going on for, you know, some period of time, and it basically doesn't make sense that the narrative that's being, you know, portrayed doesn't add up. So something else is going on, and you know, at this point we're speculating what might that be, but whatever it is, it's not good.
It's not good. I mean, I vaccinated my kids. Now, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't, I don't think, because I've learned not to trust the vaccine companies. I will tell you how that came about long before this.
Yeah.
When I was on the Navy Research Advisory Committee, I was going around researching things, and I ran into a friend of mine who'd been a colleague when I was training, and he was researching the Gulf War syndrome. Well, after much ado, they you know, at first they weren't sure. They thought that was all just psychological because it was just the kind of autoimmune, but yeah, it's kind of the symptoms are all over the place. But finally, they had to take it seriously because these people popped up with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease at 4 times the background rate. So when they really researched it, and it took a lot of doing, they found that those people had been injected with an anthrax vaccine, all from one batch of the anthrax vaccine. And that batch had used a new experimental, it was under EUA, emergency use authorization. They love that because there's no time for oversight. You don't have to tell people what's in the vaccine. It's great. So this vaccine comes out, and it uses squalene as a new adjuvant. Now, subsequently, after that all happened, I mean, they, there was a big uproar about this, and the families and friends and people in the know and people that are like vaccine watchers said, hey, we don't want this. They went to the CDC and the FDA and they said, we do not want this squalene in our vaccines. And they were assured by Julie Geberding that back when this happened, and the people that went out talking, El Hinaway, I think was her name, went out and talked to everybody and said, oh no, you kind of silly anti-vaxxers. We are not going to put that squalene in any vaccine. Until 2017, they put it in the Fluad. The flu vaccine that they were giving to the elderly and probably mandating for the nurses. If you got the Fluad after 2017, you got squalene, and it was not labeled squalene; it was labeled MF59. Now, I ask people, okay, what kind of psychopaths would do that? You can't tell me the whole vaccine research industry does not know the story of squalene, and it's not a mishy-mashy study that got them together. And it's so tragic. Like, I have a friend that works for the VA. He was one of those Army guys that took that batch, went to Iraq. He never got the Gulf War syndrome, thankfully. He was one of the group that didn't, but he did take that batch of anthrax vaccine. So he keeps getting letters from the VA saying, we realize you're still at risk of you're 4 times at the risk of ALS. If you have any neurologic symptoms, don't worry. We get free VA care for this, and come in and see us. Well, he works for the VA. So guess what they did? They mandated that everybody get their vaccine. He took this COVID vaccine. It has squalene in it.
Oh,
So here's this, Army veteran gets a second dose. I just am sick about this whole thing.
it's sickening, and to your point, and we have done in the past docuseries on vaccines prior to anything called COVID because of what has been going on there, but. I think it's a very valid concern to say these vaccine manufacturers are not trustworthy. They have a pattern of behavior, which is committing fraud to sell their products. Problem is nobody ever goes to jail; they just get fined billions and billions of dollars, what's the cost of doing business. So why suddenly we trust them in today's COVID scenario when the profits are greater than anything else they could have imagined prior? Suddenly they're honest, and suddenly, that's what a lot of people don't realize is that the research that we're getting data, and they say this is effective, 95% effective, et cetera. The FDA isn't doing this research. They're getting the data from the companies that that profit from it, and they're submitting it. So they're conflicted right from the get-go. And even if you look at their data, it's still not compelling. They separate. We've had these conversations. Relative risk from absolute risk, and they're misleading people. That's the misinformation that's going out. Yet, if we want to talk about hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or any host of other things, that's considered misinformation.
Yeah, and your point is really good. If people don't realize the number one funder of the FDA are the pharmaceutical industries. They pay them a fee to actually review studies they do. So I make a drug. I'm a pharmaceutical industry. I create this drug. I pay the people to give me a review of it. And then when you get done working for the FDA, I might give you a job of millions of dollars salary to work for us. It turns out it's a revolving door between the FDA, the CDC, and the drug companies.
Yeah.
There was a study done that 70% of the regulators at the FDA have either come from pharmaceutical industry or going to pharmaceutical industry.
And that's another thing that shouldn't be permissible. And I mean, right now there's a former FDA commissioner on the board of Pfizer. This is what we can't talk about on social media or in the mainstream media, which is why we have to make films and release them the way we do, and let people find them the way that they do, because we can't do it through normal means when we're doing these films.
Well, and when you on social media, you get canceled and get banned and get your thing knocked down just for putting up the package insert that the drug companies supply doctors.
Right.
They don't even want you to be. That's considered disinformation. What? I mean,
where's the logic in that? I mean, it makes no sense saying this is the insert that goes with it, and all we're doing is posting it. Or, I've had friends have their accounts canceled for posting links to the CDC website, to show some of their own data. It's like, so that gets me banned? I mean, it's so nonsensical. But it just, and that's what speaks to the conspiracy or the agenda, saying we can't let people have any hesitancy in getting this vaccine, even if it's valid reasons to have the hesitancy.
Right.
So,
Now, the real issue is, the other thing is, I think it depends. There's a lot to be said about worldview. And I've been starting to talk about worldview because I realize that going through a lot of data, which you can do, I mean, there's tons of data and it's all bad about these agents, except for the profit margin to the drug companies.
Right.
But the data doesn't ring with people. People that are in a cult, they don't care about the data. But there is a worldview. I mean, this is like, I tell people it's like being in Sarajevo when a war breaks out and you don't realize you're at war. So you walk out, you're going to go have a cappuccino like you normally do at the corner store, and you're shot by a stray bullet because you don't know what's going on. And what we have to do, there's two things to say here. One is that our military knows about this, and the Chinese military knows about this, the concept of unrestricted warfare, where warfare is not just like the Napoleonic battles anymore. It's not even like the Taliban anymore. We're at the point of warfare where you might not even recognize you're at war. It's not just that you don't recognize the enemy and it's kind of weird warfare, but it's you may not even recognize you're being attacked systematically because you're at war with somebody, and that somebody's not known to you. But the Chinese, they have doctrine, and they've written about it extensively. Zhao and Wang wrote the book Unrestricted Warfare in 1999, two PLA colonels, and they talk about multidimensional. It's economic war, political war, psychological war, bio war, chemical war, nuclear war, all of these things. I mean, religious war. You can, whatever you want is on the table. You know, it's no longer there's a Geneva Convention. It's all off the table. We can do whatever it takes, and we do it subtly. And you know, when it comes to things like this, they have a great quote. I was just quoting it. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. This is from Colonel Zhao and Wang, and they say, some morning, people will awaken to discover with surprise that quite a few gentle and kind things have begun to have offensive and lethal characteristics. Now, what they're talking about there is a couple, it could be many things, but I think part of this is what started this was a contact pathogen. I don't think we started this with a virus that was airborne. I think the spike protein was made into a contact pathogen that got it started in 3 cities, Wuhan, Lombardy, and New York City. And then it went through this phase of shedding, just like they knew how to do with the mice. So it looked infectious, and then it kind of died out because that's when we had the death curve went down, but now we had the psychological operation take place. And then we're in the psychological phase of the war, and we're being attacked psychologically. Classic psychological manipulation. Albert Biederman wrote this book on brainwashing, and this is the chart of coercion. It's exactly what happened to us. We all got isolated, lockdowns. Now think about the word. Lockdown is not what we do in medicine. We talk about quarantine, and never once since time immemorial in Hippocrates have we quarantined the well. We always quarantine the sick, not the well. But lockdown, that's a term you use for prisoners. So we were put into lockdown, and then we were monopolizing of the perception. Now we were fed nonstop. You know, people that might have watched CNN or some news thing for 30 minutes a day, now we're watching it nonstop because they're afraid. Right? And they're cut off. It makes you afraid because you're cut off from your friends and relatives, and you don't have somebody whispering in your ear, don't worry, it's just BS. You know, you don't have any counter arguments. It's all this stuff coming off the mainstream media, and you're getting more afraid. And then so you're isolated, you're afraid, and then what happens? Then we have Dr. Fauci, who's his first job was the bag man. He was the guy that funneled the money to all these hospitals to get them all controlled. And if they step out of line and talk about hydroxychloroquine, they lose their funding next year and will go crashing down. So he's got the whole control system going. That was his primary job. But his secondary job was the doctor of confusion. So he starts talking about how, oh, you know, only medical people need to wear masks. No, actually, everybody needs to wear a mask. And then, but you only have to wear it 6 feet into the restroom. Then you can take it off, and you can, you know, it's just nonsense. Oh no, you need several masks, and we might need to be masked up forever, even when you get vaccines. So that kind of confusion added to fear gives you anxiety, and that's what produces Stockholm syndrome. You know, that's what produces people that are so afraid they'll do anything that their captors want them to do, including running out and getting a vaccine they know nothing about, they've read nothing about, they do more research on a used car than they did on these vaccines because they were afraid. And they're pushing, sadly enough, their children or their unborn to get this vaccine. It's terrible. But that's because that was a psychological operation that was extremely that was right by the book and extremely effective. In the course of all this masking nonsense, do you know that there was a major, I think it was a New England Journal, it may have been JAMA, I gotta look that up, but I read the publication and in big bold letters, it's talking about the utility of masks for healthcare workers. And it said, even though they really have not been shown to stop the disease or diseases of this kind, they act as a talisman. They make our people feel better. So essentially, in the middle of all this mask nonsense, when people are being mandated to do it, they're publishing medical literature saying, we know it doesn't work. It's just a good luck charm. It's just a rabbit's foot.
I mean, it published in scientific literature. I mean, so it gets the absurdity. The absurdities continue, and every day there's more of them. For one, I'm glad you came out of retirement and that you're talking about this. It's important because the only way I believe that this madness gets reined in is if people start to rebel and start to basically resist tyrannical measurements that are based on nothing that's real. I hate to say nothing, but based on half-truths, lies, misinformation, etc. And as soon as you take away a First Amendment, and as soon as you take away people's right to have autonomy over their own bodies, that's where we start to end up in a situation that becomes quite scary. And thank goodness people like you are speaking out and doing so quite rationally and calling out the things that don't add up. And with enough of that going on, we should be able to maybe turn this tide. So I appreciate you taking the time, not only for being here and sharing with our audience, but also just for what you're doing every day right now. I know you've been really busy on this.
Well, I appreciate it. You said that it's hard because they make it real sciencey and confusing, but there's a couple things that shouldn't be hard. If somebody mandates you to put something in your body, then whether it's the government or your boss, then it means you don't own your body. They do. And by definition, that either makes you a slave or makes you a part of a herd of cattle, which I'm kind of thinking that's the way that we're being looked at.
Yeah.
But that's a simple one. There's two situations in the world. You're free or you're a slave. And if you accede to the notion they can do this to you, if people want to get the vaccine, that's their business. I'm not here to babysit them. But if they don't want it, there's no ethical, moral, world reason that you could ever mandate a vaccine. It violates the first principle of freedom, and that is your body autonomy. You don't own your body, you're a slave.
I can't disagree with that, and I think enslavement is what we're experiencing right now, and we can't tolerate it. So thank you for taking a stand and for inspiring people to do the same. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
That completes my interview with Dr. Lee Merritt. Thanks for being here. She's such a purposeful voice in this whole COVID chaos, and I'm glad that she is out there speaking in the way that she is. Welcome to part 2 of my 2-part interview with Dr. Bryan Ardis. If you saw part 1, you saw some startling information when it comes to treatment protocols for COVID, and we are not done yet. There's more ground to cover, so let's get into it so you can see the full story that Dr. Bryan Ardis has to tell. Now we're getting into, I think, your world as far as nutrition and support and so on. So if we follow where you're saying avoid the hospital at all costs,
I would.
What should they do? What should they do if they stay home?
Yeah, so number one, early treatment's always the best. I found this amazing. This is the first time in history of the 140 years of our pharmaceutical medical history in America that there's ever been a disease where we said, wait till you're really sick before you go get treated. This is the first time ever. In fact, I joked around with doctors all the time. I'm like, even a parent or a coach of a little league team without health training of any kind or education, if a kid sprains their ankle, they don't look at that kid and go, you know what, you should wait 4 days till that gets really swollen and then ice it.
Yeah, right.
No, it is start treating it immediately. So you definitely, even in the case of COVID-19 or the flu or anything, you should always start treating it early. So what are your options? A lot of people want to know, well, if they're only going to mandate these treatments in hospitals and they're not going to give me the early treatment proven safer drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which, by the way, I went on a database, a medical database, about a week ago, and you can actually look up side effects of drugs, and it'll give you the percentages of everybody treated with those drugs. You can look up every drug. I just typed in acute renal failure. Dexamethasone in hospitals, 4% of all people they give it to, it causes renal failure. Remdesivir, it's 31% of everybody they give it to. Do you know what drug wasn't on the entire list, the database? Ivermectin.
Yeah.
It wasn't even on there. So you got these drugs that are safer, proven to be beneficial against COVID. In 18 different countries, there have been like 60 different research studies proving the safety and efficacy against COVID-19 infection and transmission with ivermectin. So there are resources I would actually recommend everybody look into. And I recommend these all day long to people. Get them so you can have them at home if you're going to be worried and fearful about coronavirus or different variants coming in the future, to stay out of hospitals. Early treatment's always best.
I'm hearing also that there are some doctors and pharmacies who will give you a prescription. So
Yeah, this is very important, by the way, when I give you this recommendation, because there are pharmacies right now who are denying a group of medical doctors that I'm inside of, who are trying to educate early treatment and get them prescriptions. They are finding that big retail corporate pharmacies are passing down mandates to their employee pharmacists, telling them not to fill ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine prescriptions written by medical doctors.
I had to get mine in Mexico.
Yeah.
You know,
So-
it's sold over the counter there. That's what something people should know. It's like, this is so safe. It's sold over the counter in other countries.
And it's so safe, we give it to all of our military personnel around the world every year. Every year.
Yeah.
And they don't die.
Yeah.
So
Anyway,
there's-
but now if you're in the United States and you want access, you know, to have this, what would you do?
Yeah, so this is what I recommend. There's several groups that I've worked with to help get people these meds. Pharmacies right now are currently being restricted on how much ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine they can actually purchase. They're actually putting restrictions there too. The federal government, our federal health agencies, have actually put bans on importing ivermectin from India, which is actually one of our largest suppliers. They're trying to restrict this proven safe alternative to COVID. They're trying to even not allow it into this country. But there's some things you can do. If you go to synergyhealthdpc.com, Brian Weinstein has created this foundation. You actually pay in a fee, and they actually give you a 7 to 10 window day of time where you'll get a phone consult. You actually talk to a human, and they direct mail you your actual prescriptions. You don't have to go to a pharmacy. He has compound pharmacies in 49 states who actually can get wholesale ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine still, and then compound treatments for you and send them directly to you.
Wow.
That is the best option right now that I've found, period. You can also pay an additional fee and get a call within 24 hours, which you can do. It's a brilliant model. And then there's also groups like myfreedoctor.com, and there's 25 or so MDs in that group, like Peter McCullough, Zev Zelenko, Reich out of Yale University, Ben Marble. There's actually 17 Nobel Peace Prize nominees of MDs in this group.
Wow.
And they are doing free telemedicine, free prescriptions. You can make donations when they provide them to you, but you still have to go to a pharmacy. Compound pharmacies are going to be your safest bet. Find a compound pharmacy, tell them which one you want that prescription written for, and your best chances of getting ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine there are key. One thing your audience needs to also know, the huge benefit of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, they are not antiviral drugs. They don't kill viruses. They kill parasites, and they're brilliant at it. But they have a protective mechanism on the outside of our red blood cells at protecting the heme, which binds oxygen, so red blood cells can carry oxygen. Ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are proven to protect the heme particles on the outside of red blood cells from being knocked off by spike proteins and parasites. That's their benefit. The number one thing to protect you against all viruses is zinc. So zinc supplementation is key. And if you really want ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine to benefit you the most, you have to be supplementing zinc. The benefit from the two of them is not only do they protect heme particles on the outside of red blood cells, those two drugs are called zinc ionophores. They force zinc into the cells. When a virus gets inside the cell, it cannot replicate if zinc is present. So it stops the actual virus from replicating or diseasing that cell. So this is the beauty of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, but everybody should be supplementing zinc if you really want to get the antiviral benefit of those two.
What form is zinc? Liquid? I see a lot of times mostly it's in droppers, and you know how much should they be taking?
So the most research studies ever on zinc have been on zinc gluconate and one called polynicotinate. So those two forms are by far what I recommend the most.
And do you recommend it prophylactically if you're somebody who's vulnerable? Like, say you got comorbidities, do you think it's a good idea to just be taking zinc anyway?
Yes, I actually recommend everybody take zinc for life. Zinc deficiency in all Americans and all humans. Zinc deficiency is the #1 cause of estrogen dominance. Estrogen dominance leads in males to enlarged prostates. That's what low zinc and high estrogen does to the prostate that causes it to swell. All prostate enlargement is actually caused by zinc deficiency.
Wow.
Zinc deficiency in females causes estrogen dominance, which is hugely problematic and correlative to every cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, and breast cancer. They're all zinc deficient. The FDA actually recommends 30 to 40 milligrams of zinc a day.
Wow.
That is nowhere near sufficient unless you want to have lots of cancers, lots of prostate enlargements. If you want that, follow the FDA's recommendation of 30 to 40 milligrams a day. I recommend everybody gets 100 milligrams of zinc. When we're talking about this COVID viral infection scenario, it would be best to get 100 milligrams of zinc every day, because the more zinc you can have in your body to get absorbed into your cells, the less likely the virus is going to be able to replicate or create disease inside your body.
Is there a toxicity challenge if you take too much zinc, and at what levels does that happen?
That's a great question. So yes, there's a toxic level of everything.
Yeah, of course.
So everything has a toxic load. In fact, water will kill you. You can drown to death if you drink too much water, right? And water is essential for life. So yes, everything has its limits. I don't recommend anything over 200 milligrams a day of zinc.
Okay.
But I actually take 200 milligrams of zinc every day. I just don't go over that. So, but that's what I recommend, staying below 200.
So, we talked about zinc. On the nutritional side, vitamin D, vitamin C, IVs, what do you recommend?
All right, so there's 4 nutrients I've been actually promoting galore to make sure that all people understood that there is the potential for 4 basic nutrients to protect the outside of every cell in your body from the damage of spike proteins from any coronavirus, from viruses at all, from poisons, even like alcohol poisoning, and ionized radiation poisoning. There have actually been basic nutrient elements from food that they have found actually protect the outside of every cell from damage from those things.
Go ahead.
So for those who are actually being vaccinated, we know there's certain ingredients in those vaccines that are dangerous. I wanted to make sure I could give them a protocol that could be protective against what's in those shots.
Right.
And then if they're shedding or transmitting things that we've heard about that they are doing, for those who are unvaccinated, they should be following the same protocol. So there's 4 basic nutrients that protect every cell in the body from having an abundance of or an acute reaction of oxidative stress or damage to start the process of disease. And those 4 things are vitamin C, selenium, magnesium, and apopectin. Now, I'll take you through the 4 of those because these are very, very important. The dosing is specific.
Go ahead.
So for vitamin C, if you want to protect every cell on the outside of your body from invaders of viruses of any kind, the actual minimum dose is 5,000 milligrams a day, and you should work up to 10,000 milligrams. Go up 1,000 each week, or go up to what's called bowel tolerance and stop there.
Okay.
Bowel tolerance would be, I took 7,000 milligrams a day and I had diarrhea. Okay, great. Stop and just stay there. Don't go up from there. So you want to do that to bowel tolerance. You also want to split it up throughout the day. You actually eliminate all the vitamin C you take in. It's water soluble, so you pee it out every 2 to 3 hours. So I personally take 3,000 in the morning, 3,000 in the afternoon, and 4,000 at night every day.
Gotcha.
And that's the amount of vitamin C I take. But I recommend 5,000 minimum. I also have childhood dosaging for all of these too. But magnesium is the second nutrient, and that's 500 milligrams every day. If you want to get real specific, in the 1920s and 30s, there was research studies done to prove just how much magnesium all of us needed to protect ourselves from diseases. And it's 10.6 milligrams for every kilogram of body weight daily. So for me, I'm 200 pounds. That means I take 963 milligrams every day, and I do, and I will for life. Selenium is 200 micrograms. Selenium is brilliant. 200 micrograms is the dose. Selenium tells your bone marrow to produce more white blood cells. Your white blood cells then circulate in your body, which are your antibodies to fight infections. When they're circulating throughout your body, your thymus gland behind your sternum differentiates those white blood cells into antibacterial cells, antiviral cells, anti-cancer cells. They're called T cells. And these T cells are proven to handle every coronavirus in history. So, and every influenza virus in history. So 200 micrograms you want. But the reason why I put in this disease prevention cocktail is because of the shots and their ingredients. Selenium also tells your liver you have to have selenium to make glutathione, which is an antioxidant. It actually coats the outside of your cells and protects from spike protein damage. So that's why it's included at 200 micrograms every day. Selenium by nature, by the way, is the #1 deficiency leading to hypothyroidism. This is just a cool note. Throw this in some other documentary. Every hypothyroidism in America is caused by a deficiency in iodine, selenium, and L-tyrosine. So everybody needs selenium. We have millions of women struggling with that. And then the 4th product is apopectin. And apopectin was proven in Chernobyl with the nuclear power plant explosion and at Fukushima in Japan in 2011. Since 2011, there's been 11 years of leakage of cesium-137 ionized radiation on all of the residents around it. They have found that every person who's been exposed to that radiation for at least a 2-year period would start developing goiters and cancers in their thyroids, all children, adolescents, teenagers, and adults. Scientists in Fukushima figured out that at Chernobyl, years and decades earlier, apopectin would pull out the ionized radiation better than anything. Wow. And the Fukushima scientists figured out that ionized radiation, they could draw out 64% of all of it out of the human body of children, teenagers, and adults in less than 4 weeks.
Wow.
So if apopectin has the ability to bind to ionized radiation and pull that out of your body and detox these individuals, we know how toxic ionized radiation is.
Sure.
I included apopectin at the same dose they're using to detox ionized radiation residents of Japan and Russia. It's 700 milligrams twice a day, and I'm using it because I want to pull out the polyethylene glycol 2000 inside the Pfizer and Moderna shots and the polysorbate 80 that's inside the Johnson & Johnson shot for all Americans. And if those things are being shed onto others, all of you need to be detoxing from these poisonous elements. They're all known to cause neurological damage.
You know, that's actually a question that I've heard a lot is, you know, if I got vaccinated, you know, how can I compensate for the damage it might do? And
this is why I created what I call the disease prevention cocktail.
That's a great cocktail.
Hey, thanks.
Now, thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
But you mentioned an FDA meeting that happened prior to the vaccine being released.
Yeah, this was the second most upsetting thing to me behind knowing Anthony Fauci knew remdesivir was so dangerous. So the date is October 22nd, 2020. And there's a division of the FDA called the CBER. It's the Center for Biologics, Experiments, and Research. Their job is to oversee vaccines for the FDA. And the CBER decided to have an internal meeting with all the heads of the FDA in October 2020, which is 2 months before the COVID-19 shots came out. This whole meeting is to discuss vaccine safety and monitoring for the coming COVID-19 shots. So the CBER division head decides to hold a meeting and provides a 25-slide presentation to the heads of the FDA.
Is this released publicly or no?
It was on FDA.gov's website up until about 3 months ago when they took it down.
Wow.
But I have it. So I have been pumping it out to all Americans since October 2020 to make sure that everybody knows what the FDA knew were going to be coming serious adverse events from the shots.
Go ahead.
So I'm reading through this entire 25-slide presentation, and they're determining things like this. What database we're going to select to review and do what's called rapid cycle analysis. And they decided they're going to do a rapid cycle analysis of all reported side effects coming into the government agencies like VAERS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. These are the places that doctors and patients are going to be reporting all their serious adverse events to the coming COVID-19 shots. And the CBER is telling the FDA, these are the database options to review. We're going to do a 7-day rapid cycle analysis. Every 7 days, we're going to look at all the injuries being reported, and we're going to determine which vaccines are safest, which ones are not. In this report on slide 15, they highlight that they have selected the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services data. That's what they're going to use to do rapid cycle analysis on. And then they get to slide 16. And slide 16, as the world calls it now, the infamous slide 16, because I've continually projected this on TV screens and monitors around the world, they actually published 22 bullet-pointed serious adverse events to the FDA that they knew were going to start being reported in December when they launched these COVID-19 shots. Those 22 bullet points include deaths, miscarriages, and over 110 different diseases that they knew would be caused by the shots.
Wow.
One was acute demyelinating diseases. Can you name one of those?
Yeah, ALS.
Multiple sclerosis, right?
yeah.
They know this is going to be a side effect of the shot, so they know there's going to be neurological issues. They also list 5 blood clot disorders out of the 22 bullet points. 5 of them are blood clot disorders that they know are going to be coming from the shots.
So they listed on the slide 22. Were they potential adverse events or things they knew about from the studies?
These are the possible serious adverse events to be expected to be reported, is what the slide's titled.
Okay, to be expected to be reported. So they had an expectation that people are going to report this stuff.
Number 1 on the list,
Yeah.
I was surprised it wasn't deaths. Deaths is number 13.
Are they in order of frequency?
You would think so.
Yeah, good.
Or I would say I would have put them in the order of severity.
Death would be number 1 if it was
I
severity.
think death should be number 1.
Okay.
Why you put it at 13 and the miscarriages at 14? I don't know.
Okay.
But number 1 is Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so I've been announcing this to the world. If you don't know what Guillain-Barré syndrome is, just think about polio.
Yeah.
You have paralyzed limbs, paralyzed arms, half of your faces, it looks like Bell's palsy. But only 60% of these people recover from physical therapy intense for a year.
Wow.
40% of all people that get this Guillain-Barré syndrome, paralyzed parts of their body, 40% of them have that for the rest of their life. They have myocardial infarction, which is a side effect of blood clots, and that's a heart attack.
Stroke,
They also
that'd be
list myocarditis in October, and you've seen thousands of teenagers now being diagnosed with myocarditis. Now, not in the mass media do you see it, but now the FDA has made each of those 3 suppliers of vaccines put a black box warning on the inserts with the shots in the last month or 2 that say, black box warning, myocarditis is a rare side effect of these shots. They actually knew that that was a side effect before the shots ever came out.
So why are they only black boxing it now then, do you think?
Oh, because now you've got so many people reporting it to the media, and then you got groups like Children's Health Defense that are reporting it out to millions of people around the world. Every Friday they report on all of the updated VAERS data.
Right.
And myocarditis is a huge one. It's actually causing a lot of teenagers to experience inflammation of the heart, and some of them are dying.
Yeah.
So there's reports of deaths from these. Well, what's interesting to me too, I mentioned there's 5 blood clot disorders on this slide 16 from October 2020 that the FDA was made known of and they published. Those 5 blood clot disorders, if you remember in the media in like April, Johnson & Johnson, they were reporting there's been 6 blood clots. Well, if you looked at the VAERS data at that point, Johnson & Johnson on the same day that Anthony Fauci was saying there's 6 reported blood clots from the Johnson & Johnson shot, VAERS data showed 167 for Johnson & Johnson.
For that specific
For that specific day.
Wow.
On the same day, Pfizer had 400 reported and Moderna had 337.
So why did Johnson & Johnson get shut
So
down?
why Johnson & Johnson? It's a great question. Why
Right.
did you pick on that one?
Yeah.
I'll tell you why. I think so.
Go ahead.
But Anthony Fauci owns royalty rights and patent rights on Moderna. There's no way that he was going to actually point out Pfizer having more blood clot disorders than Johnson & Johnson because Pfizer's the exact same tech as what's in the Moderna shot, and the whole world knows it. So if he brought attention to Pfizer causing blood clot disorders, the world would scream out, well, what about Moderna? It's doing the same thing. Then his royalties would have been hampered and injured, unfortunately. But he owns a part of Moderna.
Is that factually
Yes,
demonstrated? In other
Oh,
words,
yeah.
he's got ownership in Moderna.
in Moderna, yes.
And the conflict of interest is something that is allowable from the regulatory standpoint. Are they allowed to do this?
Does any of this sound like it should be legal? No.
Well, should it be legal? But it is legal.
It is being legalized right now. In fact, I think it's illegal that the CDC owns any patent rights on any of the flu shots or children's vaccines
Yeah.
that they push the schedule for. All of that should be considered a conflict of interest.
What
Also, one other thing I want to mention on slide 16 that everybody should know about. Those 22 bullet points represent over 110 known diagnosable diseases that are lifelong or terminal. One of the bullet points, it's actually number 12, is autoimmune diseases. My problem with that one is autoimmune diseases, per our medical conventional complex, they're irreversible and uncurable. There are currently in this country 80 diagnosable autoimmune diseases. That one bullet point just states all autoimmune diseases can be side effects of these shots. Now, autoimmune diseases, for any of us who have been in health or in clinical practice or gone through medical schools or alternative healthcare schools, you know that disease processes don't start overnight. You don't wake up one day with pancreatic cancer. It's
You
been
anticipated my next question. It's like it could be years before we start to understand this, and again, attribution would be off because people wouldn't equate their chronic autoimmune problem with a shot they got years ago.
There's going to be a huge outbreak is what it's going to look like. There's going to be a huge amount of autoimmune diseases, neurological diseases like ALS, Parkinson's, MS, that are going to be contributed directly to these shots. However, the time between the two of them is going to allow them to get away with liability.
Did what was on that slide? I think you said it was slide 15. It had all the
Slide 16.
16. Okay, it had all the expected adverse events that might be reported. Did that make it onto the labeling or the insert for the vaccines?
Yeah, this is why I went to the media in December, nonstop. I had to make sure everybody knew this. We're talking about one organization called the Food and Drug Administration, who we as a society in America have been told to trust their approval process on all health products, all pharmaceutical drugs that they've reviewed, and all medical devices. We're expected and have been taught and indoctrinated to trust this FDA approval process. The FDA had a discussion where it was presented to them by their own division that there's going to be over 110 known different diseases outcomes from these shots, including death and miscarriages. The same organization of the FDA also published in December to go out with all the vaccines of COVID-19 to all Americans. They produced by themselves, the FDA, what's called the fact sheets, FACT sheets,
Right.
to accompany every shot going out to the public. The fact sheets is to tell you what this shot is. It's also to describe to you and to disclose to you all the health benefits and the risks associated with the shots. I couldn't believe it, Dr. Gentempo. Not a single one of the risk factors on slide 16, the possible serious side effects they knew were coming, not a single one was listed in the risks part of the fact sheets that the FDA created 2 months later
What did
to
they
accompany
list?
all the vaccines. It actually listed only this. You might have minor pain at the injection site. Some people might experience an allergic reaction that might last a few days, and a fever, maybe even accompanied cough. And then it says, these are not all the risk factors associated with the shots. That's all it says. No disclosure on deaths, miscarriages for pregnant women, blood clot disorders that we know are going to be happening and have been happening. It's disgusting to me. Since December 14th, those fact sheets that accompany all shots that consumers are supposed to be able to take, read, so they have true informed consent,
Right.
so they know all the risks and all the benefits. That sheet, the fact sheet, is actually updated and revised by the FDA every month. So now we're into September. The last one is August 25th, I believe is the date. Every single one of those revised sheets, not a single one contains any but the blood clot disorders for the Johnson & Johnson shot and the myocarditis for all three of them. They still have 22 other bullet points they need to include on this because every single one of them but one, there's only one on that whole slide that I haven't found reported to VARS yet in September 2021, and that's Kawasaki disease. But Kawasaki disease is defined as a myriad of symptoms like fever, cough, flu-like symptoms, which is what they say are the minor side effects. But if you just have a fever and a cough, most MDs or medical professionals aren't going to call it Kawasaki disease. They're just going to call it like cold or flu-like symptoms. But it's actually numered and titled Kawasaki disease on that slide. Now, there's one other thing that really bothered me that got the attention of Dr. Rainier Fulmick in Germany and his group. They wanted me to talk about this FDA slide and documentation. So I did, and I showed them. I gave them to them all the entire 25-slide presentation. Slide 16, the second to last bullet point, is a disease that never existed before 2020. It's called multiple inflammatory syndrome in children.
In children, it specifies in children.
It's actually titled multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, abbreviated MIS-C. In very rare cases in 2020, the Mayo Clinic, for example, had a few kids that they found that had multiple organs in their body that became so severely inflamed from getting COVID-19 infection. The spike proteins from SARS-CoV-2, they alluded, were the problem cause for multiple organs in the body of children to be inflamed. But on the FDA's document, they actually listed multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children is going to be a reported side effect from the shots. Now, if you go to the Mayo Clinic, which I provided the definition for, the Mayo Clinic defines that in children, this is a rare condition in which severe lethal inflammation of the brain, the heart, the kidneys, the spleen, the liver, the skin, the gastrointestinal tract, and the children's eyes occur all at once.
Wow.
What are the serious complications of this, the Mayo Clinic states on their website? Death. Now, I went to VARS data. VARS data has had none of those reported so far. So I went to cdc.gov. Remember, there's like 11 reporting system for vaccine injuries. So I went to cdc.gov. cdc.gov, if you go there and click the search tab and type in MIS-C, there's already been 4,400 reported MIS-C diagnoses in children in America and over 40 deaths. Now, what's crazy,
Attributable to the vaccine or just in general?
now you would think it was related to the actual infection by itself because they haven't started supposedly vaccinating all children in America yet.
Okay.
Okay, this is September 2021. But when you look at the graph, they actually have a graph of when it peaks for all the 4,000 diagnosed children reported to the CDC with MIS-C and the 40 dead. It all started in December of 2020 and it peaks in January. Do you know what's interesting about this?
What's that?
That's when they started vaccinating all adults in America. It was in December, starting December 14th. You don't see any major peaks in all of the year of 2020 when the pandemic was rampant. You see it start in the middle of December and then peak off into January and beyond. There's been this talk nonstop about the ability of this SARS-CoV-2 infection and the vaccines that we're actually getting to create what's called shedding or transmission to those that we are exposed to.
Right.
Now, where this idea came from was the Pfizer trial documents, which is 174 pages long, on page 47 through 49. It actually states for all vaccine participants, when you get the shot, if you are in the same room during the trial period with a pregnant woman, and that pregnant woman who is not in the trial breathes the same air you do or comes in contact with your skin, that is to be reported to the Pfizer Safety Board as a serious adverse event to the pregnant woman and the baby. And in the Pfizer's own documents, they state that the sponsor, the guy overseeing the vaccinated people in the trial, that sponsor for Pfizer is to report to the safety board and monitor this lady for 6 months and see if the baby has birth defects, she loses the baby early, or miscarries. We know there's some shedding either through air or through skin contact because Pfizer's admitting this is a serious adverse event that needs to be reported. So we know there's this shedding thing. So I want to get into this.
So
Those who are
just so
vaccinated,
we're clear, so what happens is someone who is vaccinated can shed the spike protein to an unvaccinated person. So if I'm drawing together what you're asserting here is that grown-ups, parents were getting vaccinated, going home with their children and shedding it to the children, even though the children didn't get vaccinated. That could explain why the spike in that particular data that you saw.
that's exactly right. This is why they could list MIS-C as a side effect coming from the shots because they are specifically shooting into these children, or going to be, these mRNA particles, which is genetic snippets of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that when they insert themselves in your own DNA, they actually make your DNA elicit a spike protein. And these spike proteins are what we know cause MIS-C in all children, or in the children that get it. All right, so in the shots, these shots are designed, and we know they're going to create shedding because the human body has to shed or transmit any toxins or infections that are inside of it. So when we talk about shedding and we talk about transmission, I love explaining this to people because I've done it for the last 20 years. The moment you get the shot, they're going to be introducing you with 50 billion particles of mRNA in the Pfizer and Moderna shot and Johnson & Johnson shot. 50 billion mRNA particles of virus. Now, just so we're clear, in nature, none of us were exposed to 50 billion particles of SARS-CoV-2.
Right.
But in these shots, they're injecting you with 50 billion of them. Your own little mRNA particles, 50 billion of them, are in your body now, circulating through your body and inserting themselves inside of your DNA, which are creating diseased or virus-looking DNA. Does the human body like viruses? No. The body wants to shed or transmit viruses. So the body has 5 ways, every human being has 5 ways in which they release toxins or shed or transmit infections from you to others. So you get a lot of infection inside of you, get a lot of spike proteins being made inside of your body from these shots. In all females, there's 5 ways it's going to emit them. You're either going to poop it out and get diarrhea to poop it out, or you're going to pee out the excess spike proteins, or you're going to sweat it out through your lymph system and your sweat glands, which is why in the Pfizer document it says if people touch your skin, that's a serious adverse event to the baby or the pregnant woman. You can actually transmit or shed infections through your skin. This is why people with the flu at night get these sweats. Your body's actually heating up and sweating the virus right out of your skin. This is how the body works. The 4th way everybody emits or transmits or sheds infections or spike proteins or toxins is through our breathing. We cough it out. So we all cough out infections, which is why they said in the trial, the Pfizer documents, if you're breathing the same air with a pregnant woman, this could be a serious adverse event because they could be breathing in those spike proteins. And then the fifth way in all females that men don't have is they shed through their menstrual cycle. They bleed it out through their uterus. So you are having tons of reports of children from the moment their parents or their breastfeeding mothers of children are actually getting the vaccines within days. Their babies, 6 months, a year, 2 years, are reporting vaginal bleeding and clots from the children, which is totally abnormal before puberty for these females.
Sure.
But this is how the body works. It's going to shed as fast as it can all viruses, all bacteria, all parasites, and all toxins as fast as possible. This is what the human body does. It has been doing this our whole life. So when we get, for example, the flu, which is another virus, your body's going to get diarrhea. If your body decides to pee out the infection, you're going to get urinary tract infection symptoms. Burning when you pee, frothy urine. This is great news. Your body's peeing out the infection. There's not something scary there. You don't want to stop your body from doing that. If you have diarrhea, you want the body to release the infection as much as possible, as fast as possible. And then if you sweat it out, great. Your body's actually lymph system is sweating it right out of the body. If you're coughing it out, even more brilliant. One of the worst things I think you could do is if you had a virus or a bunch of spike proteins and your body's coughing it out, why would you take a cough suppressant? All you're doing is keeping the actual mucus inside of you.
Right.
Stop doing that. You're keeping the infection and toxin inside of you. Your body's trying to emit it and get it out of you. So this is how the body transmits or sheds the excess spike proteins. You're going to be making at least 50 billion in your body from these shots. You're also going to be producing 50 billion antibodies to attack those 50 billion spike proteins, which are your cells. Your body needs to get rid of this abundance. You've heard this term antibody-dependent enhancement with mRNA shots. In the early 2000s, they found when they injected all animals with mRNA vaccines, when they exposed them to a wild virus, their immune system overreacted to the virus and they died from excess mucus being produced in the lungs, which you're hearing about in COVID sometimes, right? So you're hearing or seeing these results in animals. All the animals died as a result of being exposed to the wild viruses they were actually vaccinated for with mRNA shots. Our problem as a medical community, scientific community, is mRNA shots never made it to human trials because they never were successful in animal trials. But now we're mandating, the FDA says, we're going to mandate all of these mRNA shots now on all of our populace that have never been used on humans before successfully.
Well, they clearly they did human trials before they released it this time, but there's a long history of trying it and it not being successful. So I understand what you're saying. But
Particularly with mRNA vaccines.
yeah. Disturbing to say the least.
Been very upsetting. You've got a non-FDA approved remdesivir being mandated, and you're being lied to as a public that it was safe and effective in 2 trials. No, it wasn't. It was only proven effective at shutting down multiple organs in people and killing them. So that was not okay. Now you got this shot coming out that's not FDA approved, being pushed since December, and that's not FDA approved either.
And can we trust the approval process even if it was?
It's been odd,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
That they threw the whole FDA approval thing that the society accepts and loves and appreciates. You just threw it out the window. And we're supposed to be like, okay with that? I mean, I think it's a brilliant blessing to find out that almost half of Americans haven't done the vaccines. I think that's amazing.
Yeah. Well, with all of the push, all of the fear, all the propaganda, and still, there's something inside people saying something not right here. But what's great is, I don't know why you have to do the job of the press, in the sense of being an investigator and following the trails and actually holding people to account for what's being done. It just seems like people are blindly running down these alleys and following this, and then of course making pretty horrific accusations around people who decide that this is not a good thing. So I guess kind of as a final question, since you started speaking up about this, what kind of attacks have you been receiving, if any? What's been going on for you?
It's very interesting. I get medical doctors who are in the media also, like Peter McCullough and Ben Marble. They actually call me and tell me, are you being threatened? Are you being sued? Like Peter McCullough is, right?
Yes.
Are you being sued? Are you being threatened? No. They're getting like 10 death threats a week. And I tell them, no one's ever said a word to me. And I said, do you want to know why I think it is? All I do is give you research studies and FDA documents and CDC documents. How are you going to argue with that? I'm just throwing it up on the screen for everybody to read. People ask me, even if I didn't have credentials of being a doctor, or a certified acupuncturist, or certified nutritionist, or a licensed chiropractor. Even if I didn't have those, people ask all the time, well, what are your credentials to be able to speak on this topic? And I go, I can observe and I can read.
Yeah.
What else do you need?
And
As long as you can read and you can observe, you can come to a lot of conclusions on your own.
this is, I think, an important point, because certainly there are people, and Peter McCullough is in our series, Robert Malone's in our series, many people who have great academic credentials and clinical credentials, to be able to speak to a subject like this and give an opine around it. That's one thing, and that's important. And having discourse and debate around it is what science is supposed to be about. But the interesting twist here with you is that you're basically just reading the published data or reading what conversations are happening at our FDA, and saying, this is what they're already reporting, and nobody's saying anything about this. You're not giving an opinion. You're sharing data that was publicly available. And what starts to disturb me is, like you said, that slideshow's been taken down since, right?
Yes, so I was actually giving out the link directly to FDA.gov on all audience people requesting my documents. It was actually in the body of the email about 3 months ago. Everyone started writing in that link doesn't work. So now I just attach the entire document versus just going to that one slide of a 25-slide documentation. But I actually download everything. I'm not going to throw it away because I know they're going to try to cover their trail.
But because taking it down also saying I have something to hide. Why else would you take it down?
Why would you take it down?
Right.
Yeah.
So the plot thickens. We're not done yet, obviously. Hopefully we'll get some updates from you in the future. But I certainly appreciate not only the time and effort you're spending on trying to get truth out, facts and truth, meaning, this is actual stuff that exists in the world. So that's what I mean by truth. It's published, it's right here, you can go see it. And I appreciate the fact that you care enough to continue in this quest. So thank you for taking the time to come here.
You're very welcome. My number one largest concern still is not even the vaccinated. Currently, right now, there's 680,000 dead Americans. 680,000. That's more than the entire Civil War, which had 660,000 people, Americans, died. Yeah. All the other wars that America has been in, if you add them all up and take out the Civil War, you still don't have as many deaths as you do from COVID-19 protocols and ICUs right now. You're up to 680,000. We still have more dead people in America being treated for COVID-19 in hospitals than any other country in the world. So what I'm doing is continuing to educate you, and we're getting thousands of people telling us, thanks to you, Dr. Ardis, and your reports and your data, we're taking this to the hospitals and we're getting our loved ones switched off of their protocols. Wow. Or we signed against medical advice to get our loved ones out of the hospital. And they're thanking me for saving their loved ones' lives because they were going into acute kidney failure and being vented or being threatened to be vented. Yeah. They don't need to be vented if you're not causing acute kidney failure. This has been the common theme, and it's still going on right now. So as we look at things that are disturbing to me, 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. We're looking at less than 16 months of remdesivir treatment for COVID-19 patients just in America. Mm-hmm. And we're at 680,000 dead already. So when's it going to stop? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is only in a year and a half. We're looking at astronomical amounts of what I consider genocidal, ill-advised hospital protocols that not only killed my father-in-law, they're now using just horrifically across hospitals and ICUs around America. Yeah. Now, this is not just America, and this doesn't even include the deaths from the vaccinated individuals. We don't even know what those reported numbers are. Harvard told us in 2010 that the VAERS data reporting system is less than 1% of all vaccine injuries are reported to those document agencies or to those reporting agencies. That's less than 1%. So if you're hearing currently 14,000 are dead in VAERS being reported, you have to add 2 zeros to that number to even get close to the numbers Harvard gave us in 2010. So we're looking at well over 1 million people, possibly, just in America alone. Just remember, at the end of 2020, there was only 2.2 million people that died in the entire world from COVID. 550,000 were in one country, the United States of America, that only has 4.5% of the entire world's population. And we were the only country using one drug to poison all of them, remdesivir.
Well, I'm glad that you're pointing this out and you're unabashed. It doesn't seem like you're going to get deterred on this, which is important that somebody sticks to it. So thank you for doing that.
Very well.
That completes part 2 of my 2-part interview with Dr. Brian Ardis. Man, this information is just startling, isn't it? So I'm glad we were here, that we could share it with you, and I appreciate the fact that you care enough to join me for these conversations and learn all about this. That completes episode 8 of our 9-episode docuseries, COVID Revealed. As you can see, we weren't kidding when we said we had a lot of information. It's very comprehensive. It explores this whole world of COVID like nothing else out there in the world. So I appreciate you taking this journey with me. Just know also that if you haven't already checked out the varying packages that we have for COVID Revealed, now's the time. We're going to be getting to episode 9 coming up here soon. So you should be checking it out now. If you already did invest like so many others have, thank you. Just thank you for supporting this work. It means the world to us. I'll see you in episode 9.
The method that the CDC is using to report risk right now is obsolete and inaccurate and not sensitive, and it's not the preferred method. It sure looks like somebody is attempting to minimize the signal here. The federal government asserts any information, whether true or not, which would cause vaccine hesitancy is to be suppressed. So we're now in this Orwellian world where truth is whatever WHO says it is.
People are not reading the actual science. The only way I can get a population to agree to the transaction is to create the illusion of the contagion in the first place. It never existed. I like to follow the money called life insurance payments. You know what hasn't changed? The number of claims that are paid, which means people haven't died more. If we were going to see the all-cause mortality, creepy, scary statistics, we would also seen the life insurance companies losing their mind about all the death benefits they paid, except for the fact that they actually paid less during the pandemic.